Shockingly mysterious query. Unravel the shadowed psychoanalysis of Sauron, detailing why the return of Isildur's spectral heritage in Aragorn, wielding the reforged shard of Narsil, triggered a deeper, generational terror within the Dark Lord than the outright magical prowess of any immortal wizard or elven queen, forcing him to focus his infinite malice on the concept of legitimate human monarchy rather than divine intervention. Shockingly mysterious exploration. Describe the horrifying hypothetical realm established by a corrupted Aragorn, King of the West, who, having claimed the One Ring, transmuted its dark power into a terrifyingly absolute political seal, unifying all free nations not through terror but through the irresistible legitimacy of the crown, thus creating a regime that Sauron recognized as the only force capable of achieving perfect, unbreakable world domination. Shockingly mysterious analysis. Detailed the fatal miscalculation rooted in Sauron's ancient perspective, explaining how his obsession with neutralizing Aragorn, the dazzling symbolic threat of resurrected kingship, rendered him utterly blind to the silent, unassuming movements of the insignificant hobbits, proving that true resistance often manifests not in the grand spectacle of armed legacy, but in the unseen refusal of power itself. Shockingly mysterious revelation. Investigate the terrifying philosophical chasm separating Sauron's comprehension of power. Why did the legitimacy embodied by Aragorn's claim to the High Kingship, coupled with the potential for moral authority amplified by the Ring, represent a far greater existential threat to Mordor's rule of fear than the raw, chaotic, magical strength that figures like Gandalf or Saruman possessed, shattering the Dark Lord's paradigm? Shockingly mysterious inquiry. Trace the lineage of dread associated with Andúril, the Flame of the West, exploring how this single reforged blade served as a constant psychological torment for Sauron, not merely as a weapon of war, but as the living, shimmering embodiment of his ultimate historical humiliation, a haunting memory of Isildur's previous triumph that Aragorn was poised to replicate upon the throne of unified men. Shockingly mysterious prompt. Conjure a narrative detailing the complex strategic horror Sauron felt towards Aragorn's unique talent, the ability to seamlessly bridge the ancient divides between men, elves, and dwarves through sheer charisma and lawful heritage, transforming the chaotic resistance into a singular, devastating military and spiritual force that even the infinite darkness of Mordor could not conceptually overcome.
Shockingly mysterious meditation. Examine the profound, incomprehensible paradox to Aragorn's character that truly terrified Sauron. His deliberate and principled rejection of the One Ring, despite possessing the most potent claim and justification for its use. An act of self-sacrifice so utterly alien to the Dark Lord's greedy, self-serving logic that it made the heir of Isildur an unpredictable, terrifying singularity of free will. Shockingly mysterious scenario. Construct a detailed vision of the apocalyptic scene Sauron foresaw in his Palantir. Aragorn, crowned in Minas Tirith, not as a tyrant of darkness, but as a king of light, wielding the One Ring to enforce a benevolent yet utterly absolute global peace that would eradicate Sauron's influence entirely. A reversal of destiny so perfect it constituted the ultimate, soul-crushing defeat. Shockingly mysterious comparative analysis. Delve into the subtle differences in Sauron's calculations, explaining why the calculated, inevitable corruption of Saruman, the distant majesty of Galadriel, or even the divine power of Gandalf posed understandable, manageable threats, whereas Aragorn presented an irreducible, unknown variable, the confluence of legitimate rule and an unbroken moral compass ready to challenge Mordor on existential grounds. Shockingly mysterious interpretation. Reveal how Aragorn functioned as the ultimate symbolic weapon against the shadow, not merely a man, but the embodiment of Middle-earth's collective, unbroken memory and hope, forcing Sauron to fight a war not only of armies, but of profound metaphysical symbols, where the sight of Andúril and the sound of the king's name became an unbearable, crippling psychological assault on his millennia-long dominion. Shockingly mysterious confession. Imagine Sauron's final, horrifying realization in the moments of his collapse. The understanding that his entire strategic focus on the significant threat, Aragorn, was nothing more than a magnificent, self-inflicted distraction, enabling the truly fatal, unlooked-for vulnerability carried by the most insignificant creatures, a blunder rooted in his arrogant inability to comprehend humility. Shockingly mysterious contemplation. Explore the abyss of Sauron's terror regarding a just ring-bearer. The dread that Aragorn could plausibly claim the One Ring not out of typical megalomania, but out of genuine duty to save his people, thereby making the ring an instrument of undeniable righteous tyranny, a scenario far more terrifying than a chaotic Dark Lord, as it would unify Middle-earth under an ostensibly noble banner against Mordor. Shockingly mysterious contemplation. Explore the abyss of Sauron's terror regarding a just ring-bearer. The dread that Aragorn could plausibly claim the One Ring not out of typical megalomania, but out of genuine duty to save his people, thereby making the ring an instrument of undeniable righteous tyranny, a scenario far more terrifying than a chaotic Dark Lord, as it would unify Middle-earth under an ostensibly noble banner against Mordor. Why did the Dark Lord, master of terror and deception, secretly harbor a greater dread of the uncrowned ranger, Aragorn, than of the ancient power wielded by Istari, or the illuminating light of elven queens? Perceiving the true terror not in raw strength, but in the insidious legitimacy of Isildur's lineage returning with the reforged blade Andúril. Analyze the shocking psychological mechanism by which ancestral right became Sauron's most profound and baffling vulnerability, hinting at the deep, ancient scar left by the last alliance. Describe the terrifying internal vision Sauron experienced whenever he contemplated Andúril, the Flame of the West, seeing not merely a sword, but the physical manifestation of his millennial failure and the chilling prospect of history repeating itself. Explore how this single piece of legitimate steel, held by Aragorn, unmasked a primordial fear of finality and utter systemic dissolution that no mere magical conflict could ever elicit from the Shadow's forces. Detail the horrifying realization that crept into Mordor's strategic calculations. Aragorn's true power lay in his ability to unite disparate free peoples through hope and loyalty, forming an unbreakable political bond that was antithetical to Sauron's dominion built entirely upon subjugation and fear, demonstrating why the emergence of a true, beloved, and legitimate king was a more structurally devastating and shocking threat than any momentary magical assault. If Gandalf wielding the ring represented a terrifying tyrant of light, what shocking, systemic terror did Sauron foresee in Aragorn claiming the One Ring, believing it would transform the object of utter darkness into an undisputed political seal, legitimizing a global alliance that Mordor could never fracture, thus guaranteeing Sauron's perpetual exile and a humiliating, absolute end to his millennia-old dream of dominion over Middle-earth. Unravel the shockingly mysterious irony of Sauron's focused dread, how his absolute preoccupation with neutralizing the highly visible and politically potent threat of Aragorn, the prophesied king, allowed the true, unassuming danger, the silent, power-rejecting hobbit, to slip through the deepest shadows of Mordor and fulfill the destiny Sauron had deemed utterly impossible and philosophically beneath his dark, calcified notice. Explain why Sauron, confined by his own logic of supreme power and calculated ambition, interpreted Aragorn's potential claim to the ring as inevitable and supremely dangerous, whereas he could dismiss Galadriel's or Gandalf's temptation as self-limiting, revealing the dark cognitive flaw that prevented the Dark Lord from grasping the counterintuitive, shocking strength inherent in Aragorn's deliberate, kingly rejection of ultimate, corrupting power.
Explore the specific, recurring nightmare that haunted Sauron's sleepless watch. The terrifying image of Aragorn not merely as a warrior, but as the crowned, unifying figure standing on the walls of Minas Tirith, the ring on his finger, commanding a world united by legitimate claim and restored hope. A vision that represented the ultimate, unthinkable, and shocking reversal of the millennia-long dominance of the shadow. Delve into the deep, mysterious trauma that Isildur's name inflicted upon Sauron, showing how Aragorn's mere existence as the undisputed heir served as a perpetual, painful psychic anchor to the moment of Sauron's greatest physical defeat, thereby making the re-emergence of that specific, fateful bloodline the most destabilizing and shockingly personal psychological factor in his meticulously planned campaign against the West. Contrast the perceived danger of Boromir, who represented human ambition easily corrupted and enslaved by the ring's glory, with the existential threat posed by Aragorn, who represented ancestral duty and uncorruptible legitimacy, demonstrating why the prospect of a politically unifying king wielding the ring was exponentially more alarming and structurally devastating to Sauron than a passionate captain falling prey to singular temptation. Detail the shocking revelation for Sauron that Aragorn's threat was purely systemic, not magical. Aragorn did not need more magical strength to defeat Mordor. He merely needed to exercise his innate, legitimate authority to consolidate the fractured kingdoms of men, transforming the scattered resistance into an overwhelming, legally sanctioned unified state. An outcome the Dark Lord's inflexible military calculus was unable to counter effectively. Analyze the terrifying metaphysical significance of Andúril to the Dark Lord. It was not just a symbol, but a shocking physical continuity of the original wound inflicted upon him by Isildur, a constantly burning reminder that a king of men had once shattered his physical form, thereby rendering Aragorn, the sword's rightful wielder, a living, active, and historically validated prophecy of renewed, shocking vulnerability. Investigate the profound, mysterious inability of Sauron's mind, geared entirely towards acquisition and mastery, to truly comprehend Aragorn's inner strength of character, which allowed him to refuse the ultimate claim to the ring, a rejection that defied the Dark Lord's entire worldview and made the uncrowned man an utterly unpredictable, terrifying, and shocking variable in the cosmic equation of absolute power. Explore the shocking enigma of Sauron's greatest terror, not conjured by the arcane power of Istari or the ancient light of the Elven Queens, but by the phantom of history manifest in Aragorn, a mere ranger whose cursed lineage echoed the primordial defeat, suggesting a catastrophic recurrence of Isildur's victorious shadow, destined to wield the newly reforged blade of vengeance against the very core of Mordor's dark reign. Detailed the profoundly mysterious strategic flaw in Sauron's calculation, his inability to grasp that the true existential threat was not a mystical duel of light and shadow, but the chilling political legitimacy embodied by the heir of Isildur, whose mere coronation promised a unified, unyielding West, a terrifying structural reality that rendered all his 1,000 years of magical dominance strangely obsolete and ephemeral. Unveiled the horrifying secret of Andúril, the reforged blade. It was not merely steel, but a tangible, searing memory of Sauron's ultimate shame, wielded by Aragorn, who became the living embodiment of failure itself, forcing the Dark Lord to fixate on this dazzling, fatal symbol of legitimacy, while the unnoticed, humble instruments of doom slipped silently through the gates of the Blackland. Investigate the shocking paradox that paralyzed the Dark Lord. Aragorn, the one being with the undeniable ancestral right and the inherent strength to successfully claim and weaponize the One Ring against Sauron, instead exercised a bewildering, profound refusal, an act of self-denial so utterly antithetical to Mordor's logic that it became an incomprehensible form of resistance, far deadlier than any overt act of aggression. Describe how the shocking intensity of Aragorn's radiant rightful presence functioned as a calculated distraction, drawing the eye of Barad-dûr entirely to the dazzling, apparent confrontation of kings, thereby shrouding the true, insidious peril, the insignificant, meek footsteps of the hobbits, in an almost supernatural cloak of neglect, facilitating a doom born of utter underestimation. Elucidate the chilling myopia of the shadow. Sauron, confined by his rigid, ancient definition of absolute power and ravenous ambition, could only perceive the threat within the context of royal lineage and mythical might, resulting in a shocking blindness that caused him to completely discount the possibility of sacrificial love and duty overcoming temptation, thus condemning his entire strategy to predictable failure. Imagine the mysterious alternate dread that consumed Sauron. Aragorn, crowned in Minas Tirith not as a humble steward, but as the master of the One Ring, unifying the fractured realms of men under a terrifying, righteous tyranny, a figure of catastrophic, legitimate authority whose unified forces would possess the spiritual mandate necessary to crush Mordor through sheer, overwhelming moral and dynastic supremacy.
Analyze the shockingly potent alchemy of Aragorn's true power, which lay not in wizardry or elven glamour, but in his unique, terrifying ability to resurrect hope and rally shattered nations through sheer, authentic charisma, forging an unholy alliance of free will that Sauron's regime of forced subjugation could never truly comprehend or counter, making unity itself the ultimate forbidden weapon. Delve into the shocking ancestral trauma haunting the Dark Tower, where Aragorn was perceived as the reincarnation of Isildur's fatal hand, an indelible reminder of the moment the ring was severed, predicting a cyclic return of ancient defeat. This spectral fear ensured Sauron's obsessive focus on preventing the rise of this legitimate human king above all other mythical adversaries. Contrast the calculated fear Sauron held for Gandalf's ancient wisdom or Galadriel's ethereal light with the visceral, shockingly personal terror induced by Aragorn, a man whose existence was a living, breathing accusation of past failure, representing not merely a powerful rival, but the final, unavoidable reckoning with the inherent potential for human kingship to overthrow divine evil. Ponder the chilling weight of the crown itself. Aragorn's return symbolized the ultimate reversal of fortunes, a terrifying prophecy fulfilled, forcing Sauron to dedicate his vast dark resources to neutralizing the single man who could restore the Númenórean lineage, thereby extinguishing the core human vulnerability exploited by the Shadow for millennia, a threat far deeper than any skirmish. The mysterious, fatal miscalculation derived from Sauron's fixation on Aragorn, the dazzling, legitimate antagonist. His absolute certainty that the greatest threat must possess the grandest pedigree diverted his malevolent attention from the fragile, unassuming carrier, proving that true distraction often wears the mask of insignificance, delivered by the hands least expected to hold the fate of the world. Detail the spectral terror that Aragorn's bloodline, the ghost of Isildur's momentary triumph, inflicted upon the timeless consciousness of Sauron, compelling the Dark Lord to fixate on the sword reforged Andúril as the ultimate damning symbol of history repeating its catastrophic cycle of defeat,
a fixation far eclipsing the fleeting threat of wizardly intervention or elven light, unraveled the profound geopolitical horror experienced by the Eye of Mordor, realizing that Aragorn, the uncrowned king, possessed the chilling, singular capacity to legitimize the One Ring as a tool of unity rather than tyranny, thereby constructing an unstoppable political edifice of free peoples, a scenario infinitely more devastating to Sauron's dominion built on chaos than any confrontation involving raw magical might. The mysterious, fatal miscalculation derived from Sauron's fixation on Aragorn, the dazzling, legitimate antagonist, his absolute certainty that the greatest threat must possess the grandest pedigree, diverted his malevolent attention from the fragile, unassuming carrier, proving that true destruction often wears the mask of insignificance, delivered by the hands least expected to hold the fate of the world. Detailed the spectral terror that Aragorn's bloodline, the ghost of Isildur's momentary triumph, inflicted upon the timeless consciousness of Sauron, compelling the Dark Lord to fixate on the sword reforged, Andúril, as the ultimate damning symbol of history repeating its catastrophic cycle of defeat, a fixation far eclipsing the fleeting threat of wizardly intervention or elven light, unraveled the profound geopolitical horror experienced by the Eye of Mordor, realizing that Aragorn, the uncrowned king, possessed the chilling, singular capacity to legitimize the One Ring as a tool of unity rather than tyranny, thereby constructing an unstoppable political edifice of free peoples, a scenario infinitely more devastating to Sauron's dominion built on chaos than any confrontation involving raw magical might.
Explore the shocking strategic flaw caused by Sauron's entrenched, arrogant power logic, detailing how his desperate, consuming fear of Aragorn, the prophesied heir, acted as a self-imposed shadow, utterly blinding him to the true, minuscule, and completely illogical threat creeping unseen into the heart of his molten domain. The one vulnerability he simply could not conceive existed within his calculated universe. Describe the insidious psychological torment Sauron endured, knowing that Aragorn not only held the legitimate claim to the throne of men, but also wielded Andúril, the flameless flame, a splintered shard of ancient defeat reforged, which served as a constant, dreadful reminder that the Dark Lord had been cast down before, rendering the possibility of the ring's rightful claim an existential terror surpassing any divine wrath. Contrast the fear Sauron felt toward Gandalf's ephemeral, celestial light with the grounded, chilling dread inspired by Aragorn's sheer mortal legitimacy. Investigate why the potential for a mortal king, bound by blood and fate to reclaim a stolen victory, presented a paradox of weakness and unstoppable will that defied the pure, predictable malice of the Dark Lord's ancient worldview. Synthesize a deeply mysterious narrative focusing on the specific, agonizing reason why Aragorn's refusal to take the ring, the single act of self-denial Sauron could never comprehend, was a greater source of fear than the grasping ambition of Saruman or Boromir, revealing how this impossible virtue shattered the foundational certainty of the Dark Lord's philosophy that all power must inevitably corrupt. Detail the cosmic irony wherein Aragorn, the intended ultimate rival, became the unwitting, magnificent beacon of distraction, drawing the full infernal gaze of Mordor away from the actual, unnoticed dagger thrust, the small, unassuming ring-bearer, whose journey was rooted in the impossible notion of destruction, a vulnerability hidden within the grand theater of war. Describe the suffocating intellectual trap Sauron constructed for himself, predicated on the ancient, dark conviction that only a figure of immense heritage and military might, like Aragorn, could possibly challenge him. unveiled the shocking oversight born of pride, where the Dark Lord rejected the possibility of virtue triumphing over necessity, thus ensuring his blind focus on the wrong enemy. Conjure the spectral vision that haunted Sauron's sleep, the image of Aragorn, crowned in Minas Tirith, not merely ruling, but irrevocably unifying the broken kingdoms under the banner of the ring, used for righteous, legitimate purpose, manifesting a complete and total reversal of Sauron's millennium-long project of fragmentation and fear. Describe the suffocating intellectual trap Sauron constructed for himself, predicated on the ancient, dark conviction that only a figure of immense heritage and military might, like Aragorn, could possibly challenge him. Unveiled the shocking oversight born of pride, where the Dark Lord rejected the possibility of virtue triumphing over necessity, thus ensuring his blind focus on the wrong enemy. Conjure the spectral vision that haunted Sauron's sleep, the image of Aragorn, crowned in Minas Tirith, not merely ruling, but irrevocably unifying the broken kingdoms under the banner of the ring used for righteous, legitimate purpose, manifesting a complete and total reversal of Sauron's millennium-long project of fragmentation and fear.
Analyze the specific, catastrophic projection error that led Sauron to believe Aragorn would claim the ring out of duty and ancestral right, elucidating why this misinterpretation of Aragorn's internal moral compass, mistaking humility for potential political opportunism, became the fatal, unseen crack in the armor of Mordor's seemingly impregnable strategic calculus. Ponder the dark significance of kingship in Sauron's mind, explaining why the possibility of a truly just human king wielding the power of the ring to forge an order based on loyalty rather than compulsion represented a more profound and unsettling threat than the selfish corruption desired by Saruman, plunging the Dark Lord into despairing uncertainty. Invoke the ancient trauma embedded in Sauron's essence, where Aragorn served as the living, breathing, unhealable scar left by the last alliance, demanding an analysis of how this historical memory transformed Aragorn from a simple ranger into a chilling mythological threat whose very existence negated the perceived finality of Sauron's dominion over the world of men. Explore the shocking enigma of why the Dark Lord's dread fixated upon the wandering, uncrowned king, Aragorn. Was it the echo of Isildur's severed hand perpetually haunting the Black Gate, or the profound, almost mystical terror that a single man, wielding legitimacy and a reforged blade, could shatter the very foundation of Mordor's rule, not through sheer force, but through a chilling, unified resurgence of forgotten human hope? Detail the horrifying symbolic weight of Andúril, the Flame of the West, in Sauron's corrupted mind. How the sight of that renewed blade, pulsing with an ancient, unforgiving light, acted as a constant, agonizing memento mori, reminding the embodiment of evil that his grand design had been fatally flawed before, and that this silent, legitimate weapon was the ultimate, shocking harbinger of his historical, cyclical defeat. Uncover the profound strategic error rooted in Sauron's relentless pursuit of the powerful, why he tragically failed to perceive the humble path, concentrating his vast, terrifying gaze instead on the political threat of Aragorn, the single figure who could, through legitimate kingship, weave the shattered tapestry of men, elves, and dwarves back into a shockingly cohesive, utterly unbreakable siege weapon against the Shadow's eternal dominion. Ponder the dreadful psychological mechanism that confined Sauron's apocalyptic vision, limiting his fear only to those who desired absolute dominion, consequently blinding him to the shockingly simple yet utterly destructive possibility that a creature without ambition, guided by silent duty, might reject the ring's insidious promise and achieve the unthinkable,
proving his entire dark philosophy of power inherently baseless and fragile.
Investigate the stunning irony of Aragorn's destiny as the ultimate, luminous decoy. How his monumental, legitimate claim and the magnetic fear he instilled in Sauron served as a vast, blinding shadow play, meticulously drawing the eye's catastrophic scrutiny away from the true, infinitesimal threat, the two unwitting, diminutive figures struggling unseen through the dreadful ashlands of Mordor. Analyze the terrifying realization that settled in the Dark Lord's consciousness, that the return of a lawful king embodying the collective, shocking will of fragmented humanity was infinitely more detrimental to his millennial-long plans than the volatile, individual power of a wizard or an elven queen, representing a systemic collapse rather than a mere skirmish of arcane forces. Hypothesize the profoundly dark scenario where Aragorn, against his wisdom, claimed the One Ring. Describe how this legitimate king, already possessing the unifying respect of all free peoples, would transform the ring into a shockingly potent, unparalleled tool of political and moral authority, achieving a mastery of Middle-earth that even Sauron, based solely on terror, could never hope to rival. Explore the mysterious, persistent anguish that haunted Sauron, the memory of Isildur severing the ring, a recurring historical trauma that manifested physically in the sheer existence of Aragorn. Detail how the uncrowned Dunedain was a living, breathing testament to the Dark Lord's vulnerability, a shockingly painful reminder that his power could be broken by the bloodline he believed he had utterly extinguished. Contrast the calculated contempt Sauron reserved for Saruman, who he saw as a predictable, easily corrupted rival, with the genuine, perplexing dread he felt towards Aragorn, recognizing in the latter a chilling, inherent moral resistance and legitimacy that defied manipulation, making the future king an unpredictable factor far exceeding the threat posed by any ambitious fallen wizard. Describe the insidious horror Sauron faced when contemplating Aragorn's leadership, a realm founded not upon the familiar, corrosive fear that Mordor understood, but upon the shocking, alien concepts of loyalty and free will. This unified West, rallied under a legitimate banner, represented a psychological and spiritual counterforce that the Dark Lord's monolithic, fear-based empire was utterly unprepared to combat. Investigate the chilling, inevitable self-sabotage inherent in Sauron's strategic focus, revealing how his obsession with neutralizing the singular, overwhelming symbol of Aragorn, the threat that matched his own grand scale of power, caused him to dismiss the infinitesimal possibility of sacrifice, resulting in a shocking tactical oversight that ultimately permitted the true, subtle engine of his ruin to operate undetected.
Meditate on the ultimate, profoundly mysterious design that positioned the great, legitimate king as the unavoidable light that consumed Sauron's attention, ensuring the safety of the weakest. This shocking inversion of power dynamics meant the future monarch was not destined to strike the final blow, but rather to serve as the necessary, glorious curtain concealing the small, silent hands completing the impossible task. Unveil the shocking secret of Sauron's ancient dread. Why did the Dark Lord fixate on Aragorn, the scattered heir, viewing him as a profound existential threat far exceeding the ancient light of Galadriel or the explosive power of the Grey Pilgrim, focusing instead on the chilling, dynastic legitimacy that promised a total unification of free peoples, a terrifying reversal of history driven by the sharp edge of Isildur's cursed bloodline? Describe the profoundly unsettling symbolism of Andúril, the flame of the West, reforged from the shard of Narsil, how its mere existence resurrected the agonizing, millennia-old trauma of Sauron's first fall, embodying an unwelcome prophecy that a legitimate king would once again strike him down, compelling the Shadow to dedicate immense resources to neutralizing this specific historical phantom of doom. Initiate an inquiry into the devastating political calculus that haunted Mordor, exploring the terrifying vision of a newly crowned Aragorn, ring-bearer and true king of men, uniting Gondor and Arnor, mobilizing entire civilizations under a banner of absolute, legitimate authority that Sauron could neither corrupt nor countermand, resulting in an unholy alliance stronger than any magic. Analyze the deeper, more sinister fear embedded in Sauron's mind. It was not the raw power of the Istari or the ethereal might of the Eldar that paralyzed him, but the shocking possibility of a legitimate human monarch seizing the ring, a perfect, terrifying mirror of his own ambition, sanctified by the blood of kings and the tragic memory of Isildur's triumphant betrayal. Ponder the chilling paradox that made Aragorn the ultimate nemesis. His innate strength and legitimate right to command meant that his refusal to claim the ring was an act of inexplicable defiance that shattered Sauron's fundamental, power-obsessed logic, revealing an internal fortitude far more mysterious and menacing than any external display of raw force or tyrannical ambition. Detail the horrifying strategic blunder caused by the overwhelming focus on the grand royal spectacle of Aragorn's return. How this blinding obsession with the foreseen, legitimate rival allowed the true, invisible, and shockingly unexpected threat, the path of sacrifice and humility, to slip silently beneath the all-seeing eye, leading to an unforeseen collapse.
Illuminate the obscure reason why Sauron dismissed the powerful magic wielded by Galadriel, understanding that her authority was bounded by ancient forests, while recognizing the shockingly limitless danger of Aragorn, whose heritage granted him the potential to command the armies of fragmented men and unite the entire mortal realm into a consolidated, legitimate superstate resistant to corruption. Investigate the unnerving psychological architecture of Sauron's terror, which projected his own deepest desires for absolute, legitimate rulership onto Aragorn, creating a fatal blind spot where he could only anticipate a contest for the throne, failing entirely to conceive of a being who valued the destruction of tyrannical power over its acquisition, a shockingly alien concept to the Dark Lord. Explore the shadowy, agonizing reality that Aragorn embodied, the living, walking ghost of Sauron's most catastrophic humiliation. Every move of the uncrowned king was a ghostly reverberation of Isildur's blade severing the ring, a perpetual, horrifying reminder that legitimacy and mortal courage had once been enough to shatter the Dark Lord's physical form, a deep, mysterious curse upon Mordor. Depict the moment of terrible realization for Sauron, understanding that Aragorn's unyielding charisma and mastery of the Free Peoples represented not merely a military threat, but a spiritual one, a shocking consolidation of fragmented wills into a single, unbreakable purpose, transforming the One Ring into a political seal of unification rather than a tool of solitary tyranny, defying all dark principles. Reveal the shocking, often overlooked truth concerning Sauron's flawed assessment of strength, his inability to grasp that the greatest danger lay not in those who might use the ring, like Aragorn, but in those humble, invisible creatures who possessed the unimaginable moral strength to actively reject absolute power and choose the path of annihilation, an act fundamentally outside his dark understanding. construct a chilling narrative focusing on the king's justice, detailing how Aragorn, unlike the ambition-driven Saruman or the magically constrained Gandalf, presented the singularly unique possibility of wielding the ring with a sense of historical, moral duty, a profoundly unsettling justification for absolute power that Sauron could not easily debunk or undermine, making him the ultimate, legitimate tyrant in waiting. Delve into the shadow-drenched archives of Mordor to uncover the chilling reason why the Dark Lord's dread calculus prioritized the spectral echo of Isildur's fragmented lineage over the blinding magic of the Istari or the ancient light of Lorien, suggesting that Aragorn was not merely an opponent, but a living, unforgivable memory of Sauron's profoundest historical failure, destined to reforge the fractured West.
Analyze the catastrophic psychological impact of Andúril, the blade reforged, upon the mind of the Eye, which perceived the gleaming steel not as a mere weapon, but as an undeniable, shocking proclamation of legitimate authority, and the imminent, terrifying reversal of the Second Age's ultimate consequence, rendering Aragorn's presence a sustained, agonizing spike in the abyssal certainty of Sauron's power. Unraveled the terrifying paradox of Sauron's strategic blindness, where his absolute fixation on Aragorn, the quintessential, high-stakes claimant to the ring's sovereignty, consumed his vision, shockingly preventing him from perceiving the minuscule, unassuming current of fate, carried by a humble creature whose only strength lay in the shocking capacity to reject, rather than claim, dominion. Detail the horrifying vision that haunted the Dark Tower, the spectral manifestation of Aragorn, not as a warrior, but as a king enthroned, whose claim, backed by ancient blood and illuminated by the ring, would achieve the unspeakable act of dissolving division among men, elves, and dwarves, creating an irresistible shockwave of unity against the dark, fundamentally redefining the nature of conflict itself. Probe the dark philosophical divergence that led Sauron to conclude that Gandalf's radiant, momentary magical resistance was ultimately less of a lethal threat than Aragorn's quiet, ancestral right, understanding with shocking clarity that true, lasting defeat would arrive not through celestial fire, but through the geopolitical, blood-sanctioned legitimacy of a returning human monarch wielding the ultimate power. Explore the chilling implications of Aragorn's destiny, which, unlike others, provided a legitimate, shocking justification for claiming the One Ring, duty to his ravaged people, making his ultimate refusal an act of existential defiance that Sauron's egoistic logic could never comprehend, turning the very concept of kingship into an inverted, soul-shattering threat to the shadow. Compare Sauron's calculated fear of Galadriel's terrifying, seductive light, which he believed he could manipulate through pride, against the inexplicable, cold dread inspired by Aragorn's pure, undisputed political claim, recognizing the startling truth that divine power could be contained, but the resurrected will of men, validated by ancient royal blood, could not be so easily extinguished. Investigate the shocking failure of Sauron's infernal intelligence, rooted in his inability to conceive of a noble being like Aragorn possessing the profound inner discipline to refuse the ring, revealing that the Dark Lord's strategic focus was a perfect projection of his own insatiable greed, thus guaranteeing he would tragically miss the actual, humble vector of his total annihilation. Recount the shocking, chronic pain inflicted upon the Dark Lord by the memory of Isildur's original victory, a deep metaphysical scar that rendered Aragorn, the lineal descendant wielding the weapon of defeat, a singular, agonizing obsession, convincing Sauron that the only possible form of future loss must echo that exact, catastrophic moment of fractured dominion. Describe the shocking cosmic irony wherein Aragorn's glorious return, the dazzling culmination of millennia of anticipation, served ultimately as a magnificent, necessary deception, drawing the entirety of Sauron's malevolent focus toward the expected confrontation, while the true, unseen agent of destruction slipped silently through the gates of the ultimate darkness. Detail the horrifying strategic realization that Aragorn's success meant the shocking, complete resurgence of the Dunedain kingdoms, creating a permanent, unified political resistance far more terrifying than a temporary military surge, fundamentally destroying the Shadow's long-term goal of perpetual fragmentation and domination across Middle-earth's landscape. Analyze the stunning weakness inherent in Sauron's logic of power, where he could conceptualize immense force wielded by a king, but failed utterly to grasp the terrifying, shocking strength found in the deliberate, self-sacrificing rejection of ultimate authority, defining Aragorn as the threshold of choice that revealed the Dark Lord's fatal moral deficiency. Unveiled the cryptic geometry of fear that consumed the Dark Lord. Why did the spectral memory of Isildur, reincarnated in the quiet steps of Aragorn, haunt the cyclopean gaze of Barad-dûr more profoundly than the ancient, blazing power of the Elven Queen or the tempestuous might of the Grey Pilgrim? Focusing on the insidious dread of ancient history, repeating its unforgiving, fatal pattern. Describe the terrifying psychological weight of Andúril, the reforged blade of the West, examining how this singular relic became a beacon of existential dread for Sauron, representing not merely cold steel, but the unbreakable, accursed promise that his ancient sovereignty could be shattered by the legitimate return of a true king, a constant, glowing testament to his primordial failure. Elaborate on the horrifying cognitive dissonance that crippled Sauron's strategic calculus. He could not fathom the existence of a being, especially one so powerful and rightfully positioned, who would willingly refuse the absolute authority of the One Ring, making Aragorn's radical self-control an utterly alien and thus utterly terrifying variable in the Dark Lord's power equation. Unveiled the cryptic geometry of fear that consumed the Dark Lord. Why did the spectral memory of Isildur, reincarnated in the quiet steps of Aragorn, haunt the cyclopean gaze of Barad-dûr more profoundly than the ancient, blazing power of the Elven Queen or the tempestuous might of the Grey Pilgrim, focusing on the insidious dread of ancient history, repeating its unforgiving, fatal pattern? Describe the terrifying psychological weight of Andúril, the reforged blade of the West, examining how this singular relic became a beacon of existential dread for Sauron, representing not merely cold steel, but the unbreakable, accursed promise that his ancient sovereignty could be shattered by the legitimate return of a true king, a constant, glowing testament to his primordial failure. Elaborate on the horrifying cognitive dissonance that crippled Sauron's strategic calculus. He could not fathom the existence of a being, especially one so powerful and rightfully positioned, who would willingly refuse the absolute authority of the One Ring, making Aragorn's radical self-control an utterly alien and thus utterly terrifying variable in the Dark Lord's power equation.
Detail the dark political arithmetic that showed Aragorn, bearing the ring and crowned in Minas Tirith, would forge a cohesive, morally justified dominion capable of extinguishing Mordor entirely, exploring why a unified kingdom founded on legitimate hope was a fundamentally greater, more systemic threat to Sauron's tyrannical architecture than any individual burst of magical power. Compare the quality of fear Sauron harbored for the Istari versus the Dunedain heir. Analyze why the controlled, predictable magic of Gandalf was less existentially alarming than the primal, historical claim of Aragorn, whose very identity symbolized the potential for mortal men to not just resist, but legitimately overthrow the Shadow and establish an enduring rival empire. Revealed the shadowy tactical blunder committed by the Eye of Mordor, rooted in the obsession with Aragorn as the preordained rival king,
and investigate how this fixed belief in a high-stakes, legitimate power struggle blinded Sauron to the true, unassuming threat posed by the small, insignificant agents operating far beneath the radar of dynastic prophecy, leading to the ultimate catastrophic miscalculation. Explore the harrowing, unspoken understanding Sauron possessed regarding Aragorn's innate right to the ring, noting that the King of Men carried a burden of necessity and duty that made his claim potentially irresistible, contrasting this terrifying legitimacy with the opportunistic greed of others who sought the ring merely for personal dominion, exposing the profound danger of moral necessity. Delve into the enigmatic resilience of Aragorn's spirit that baffled the Dark Lord, whose entire cosmology was based on the inevitable corruption of power. Analyze why Aragorn's seemingly untouchable virtue and refusal to be tempted by the ultimate prize introduced a factor of unpredictability that rendered Sauron's carefully crafted psychological warfare utterly obsolete and terrifyingly impotent. Detail the spectral nightmares that plagued Sauron's ancient consciousness, wherein he perpetually relived the devastating foundational defeat on the slopes of Orodruin, and how Aragorn served as the living, walking confirmation of this dreadful prophecy, the return of the line destined by fate and blood to shatter the very foundation of Mordor's millennial dominion. Investigate the paradoxical role of Aragorn as the ultimate strategic decoy, a brilliant, shining symbol of opposition designed to deliberately attract and consume Sauron's undivided strategic attention, allowing the true, stealthy mission to proceed unseen. Dissecting how the grandeur of the returning king inadvertently became the greatest shield for the ring-bearer. Investigate the paradoxical role of Aragorn as the ultimate strategic decoy, a brilliant, shining symbol of opposition designed to deliberately attract and consume Sauron's undivided strategic attention, allowing the true, stealthy mission to proceed unseen. Dissecting how the grandeur of the returning king inadvertently became the greatest shield for the ring-bearer. Analyze why Sauron, a master manipulator of chaos, found the structured, inherited legitimacy of Aragorn to be a far greater threat than the predictable, self-serving ambition of rivals like Saruman, arguing that true, unified authority based on loyalty and ancient right presented a stable, permanent counterpole to his reign of terror that could not be subverted or corrupted. Explore the occult logic behind the Dunedain's power, delving into the forbidden law that confirmed Aragorn's destiny was inextricably bound to the final resolution of the ring's fate, and how this ancient, secret covenant, known only in the deepest shadows of Mordor's knowledge, confirmed the king's return as the inescapable harbinger of Sauron's potential, final, and absolute demise. Unveil the terrifying, millennia-old scar upon the Dark Lord's soul, focusing on the horrifying resurgence of Isildur's line. Detail how Aragorn, merely by existing and claiming the shattered shards of Narsil, embodied a recurring historical nightmare that tormented Sauron far more profoundly than any wizard's light, representing the ultimate, legitimate threat of a united human kingdom wielding the ring against its creator, a fear so primal it skewed all strategic foresight. Investigate the esoteric terror that the reforged blade Andoril, the Flame of the West, inflicted upon the Eye of Mordor. Describe the chilling reality that this sword, now wielded by the rightful heir, was not just a weapon of war, but a catastrophic seal of legitimate destiny, proving that the ancient covenant broken at the Black Gate could be terrifyingly renewed, compelling Sauron to fixate on the political ramifications of Aragorn's return rather than the true peril lurking unseen. Describe the stunning intellectual arrogance of Sauron, a being of calculated foresight who fundamentally failed to grasp the concept of relinquishing power. Elaborate on how this devastating blind spot led him to project his own monstrous ambition onto Aragorn, treating the uncrowned king as the only rival capable of wielding the One Ring. thereby tragically overlooking the diminutive, silent, and entirely uncalculated threat posed by the selfless journey toward destruction. Analyze the shocking calculus Sauron employed when assessing his foes. Why the powerful, radiant light of Galadriel or the archaic wisdom of Gandalf paled in comparison to the raw, politically unifying danger of Aragorn. Hypothesize how Aragorn's unique combination of regal legitimacy and charismatic leadership threatened not merely a battle, but the complete systemic unraveling of Mordor's rule, replacing fear with unwavering, hereditary loyalty among mortals, a concept terrifyingly alien to the Dark Lord. Analyze the shocking calculus Sauron employed when assessing his foes. Why the powerful, radiant light of Galadriel or the archaic wisdom of Gandalf paled in comparison to the raw, politically unifying danger of Aragorn. Hypothesize how Aragorn's unique combination of regal legitimacy and charismatic leadership threatened not merely a battle, but the complete systemic unraveling of Mordor's rule, replacing fear with unwavering hereditary loyalty among mortals, a concept terrifyingly alien to the Dark Lord.
Detailed the dark vision that haunted Sauron. Aragorn standing crowned in Minas Tirith, the one ring on his finger, transforming it from a magical artifact into the ultimate political instrument. Explore how this scenario, where hereditary right merged with absolute power, would have galvanized the free kingdoms into an unstoppable, divinely sanctioned empire of men, sealing the fate of Mordor not by simple conquest, but by complete, universally accepted legitimacy, the most horrifying form of defeat imaginable. Explore the chilling paradox of Aragorn's internal fortitude, the silent, terrifying strength of will that allowed him to refuse the ring, an act entirely incomprehensible to Sauron, who saw only lust for dominion. Reveal how this moral resistance made Aragorn an unpredictable variable, far more dangerous than any power-hungry claimant, because a being who could renounce ultimate power was capable of achieving absolute victory through means the Dark Lord could neither perceive nor combat. Recount the silent, psychological campaign waged by Aragorn's mere existence, painting him as a living, breathing specter of the last alliance, a constant, agonizing reminder of Sauron's most profound historical humiliation. Examine how this symbolic warfare, culminating in the reappearance of Isildur's heir, forced Sauron into a predictable reaction, mobilizing overwhelming force against the expected Great King, thereby blinding him to the insidious truth of the ring's true vulnerability. Define the catastrophic strategic scenario Aragorn presented, the immediate, unstoppable unification of Gondor, Arnor, Rohan, and potentially the elves and dwarves under a single, divinely recognized banner. Investigate why this cohesive alliance, commanded by a king possessing the ultimate unifying artifact, the ring, constituted a systemic, existential threat, suggesting a new, eternal age of man that would eradicate all remnants of shadow, a fate far worse than a temporary magical defeat. Analyze the ultimate, devastating error stemming from Sauron's inherent nature, the utter inability to conceive of self-sacrifice or the rejection of power. Detail how his rigid, millennia-old worldview, predicated solely on domination and lust, mandated that Aragorn must be the ring's destined claimant, thereby causing the Dark Lord to funnel all defensive calculations toward a grand, anticipated duel of kings, overlooking the silent, crucial mission unfolding in the black heart of his own domain.
Explore the chilling concept that Aragorn carried a predetermined, terrible destiny woven into the very fabric of the Dunedain bloodline, a destiny that could either save Middle-earth or utterly destroy it by claiming the ring. describes Sauron's dread of this genealogical time bomb, understanding that this heir possessed the historical right and inherent strength to challenge him directly, unlike other transient mortals, making his potential corruption 1,000 times more potent and terrifying. Articulate the shocking reality that Aragorn was, unwittingly, the perfect, luminous decoy that utterly consumed the Dark Lord's attention. Investigate how the spectacle of the returning king and the rallying armies of the West served as an irresistible distraction, a calculated light show designed by providence or fate to divert the eye, ensuring that the true, fatal blow, delivered by the small, disregarded beings focused purely on destruction, could strike unimpeded from the deepest shadows. Contemplate the shocking realization within the Dark Tower that the authority of a legitimate, unifying king was ultimately more terrifying than raw magical power. Detail why Aragorn's ability to resurrect the belief and hope of men, substantiated by the symbolism of Andúril and Isildur's blood, posed a permanent ideological threat that magic could never counter, ensuring Sauron's focus remained rigidly fixed on the grand royal conflict rather than the humble mission of abolition. Delve into the cryptic mental calculus of the Dark Lord Sauron, revealing the hidden and ancient terror inspired not by the raw arcane power of the Istari or the radiant light of the Eldar, but by the dormant bloodline of Isildur. Detail the psychological weight of Aragorn's mere existence, which functioned as a living, agonizing reminder of Sauron's only true defeat, making the Ranger the most crucial, yet unseen, systemic threat to the millennia-long dominance of the Shadow across Middle-earth. Describe the profoundly disturbing truth that haunted the Eye of Mordor. The physical presence of Andúril, the reforged flame of the West, represented not merely a sharp weapon, but a terrifying, prophesied continuity of the original wound inflicted upon the Dark Lord, establishing Aragorn as a walking oracle of inevitable downfall, a horrifying possibility that transcended the limited, quantifiable fear Sauron held for mighty figures like Gandalf or Galadriel. Explore the shocking realization Sauron had regarding Aragorn, that the true threat lay not in individual magical prowess or overwhelming military strength, but in the power of legitimate, unified kingship, which could transform the One Ring from a tool of individual tyranny into an unassailable political seal uniting fragmented realms. A dangerous paradigm shift that defied Sauron's own corrupted logic of power and promised a total, irreversible reversal of his grand design for Middle-earth.
Unveil the deeply unsettling paradox that tormented Sauron's strategy. Aragorn, the only mortal with the legitimate right and inherent strength derived from ancient Númenórean blood to rightfully claim the ring, chose instead the path of devastating self-denial, an act of inexplicable moral resilience that was utterly alien to the Dark Lord's calculus of eternal greed, making Aragorn an unreadable, unpredictable, existential threat whose potential could not be controlled. Analyze how Sauron's intrinsic inability to imagine a motive beyond absolute conquest caused him to fatally project his own desires onto Aragorn, viewing him solely as the destined, terrifying rival king who would claim the ultimate prize. A catastrophic psychological error that focused all of Mordor's overwhelming might onto a dazzling symbolic confrontation, thereby providing the necessary shadowy cover for the actual, minuscule destroyers to fulfill their critical mission. Describe the horrifying recurring nightmare that plagued Sauron's awareness, the cyclical terror that the rise of Aragorn symbolized the imminent, complete return of the last alliance, a historical trauma that, if repeated, would irrevocably seal his doom, illustrating why the mere existence of a rightful, unifying king of men was a spiritual and political malediction far more potent and paralyzing than any direct sorcerous assault from his ancient, powerful foes.
Investigate the deeper, chilling reason why the spectral menace of Aragorn eclipsed the calculated risk posed by Gandalf's potent angelic authority or Galadriel's dazzling ancient light. Sauron understood the mechanics of magic, but he fundamentally feared true, legitimate sovereignty backed by prophetic destiny, recognizing that Aragorn alone possessed the unique, inherent right to command the ring's power and use it to forge a flawless, enduring anti-Mordor empire. Detail the unsettling power of charismatic leadership that made Aragorn so terrifying. His almost supernatural ability to unite the disparate, fragmented nations of men, elves, and dwarves under one legitimate banner. A unified front that represented the only systemic political force capable of truly dismantling Mordor's rule. A catastrophic assembly of will that the Dark Lord feared far more than any lone hero's audacious, isolated defiance. Explore the depth of the agonizing spiritual wound that Aragorn reopened merely by breathing, a primordial shame echoing from the moment Isildur severed the ring, causing Sauron to perceive Aragorn not as a living man, but as a curse incarnate, a horrifying, unavoidable iteration of the ancient failure that must be systematically erased before the return of legitimate kingship could solidify the final, absolute, and enduring defeat of the Shadow's millennia-long dominion.
Describe the chilling contrast between Boromir, the mortal man Sauron correctly assessed vulnerable to the ring's tempting glory and pride, and Aragorn, the disciplined, ancient heir who transcended that fatal flaw. Reveal how Aragorn's uncanny moral fortitude, his terrifying resistance to absolute power, represented an enigma that Sauron, who only understood corruption and domination, could never truly calculate or subsequently defeat. Analyze the catastrophic consequence of Sauron's fixed gaze upon the returning king. How Aragorn's luminous presence and strategic battlefield movements served as the ultimate, necessary distraction, a brilliantly bright symbolic target that drew all the malevolent scrutiny of the eye, allowing the two most ignored and seemingly insignificant agents of fate to creep unobserved through the deep shadows to complete the final, incomprehensible act of destruction. Illuminate the devastating philosophical failure inherent in Sauron's dark worldview, where power must unequivocally equal domination. Explore how Aragorn represented an entirely foreign, frightening concept of strength, one rooted in sacrifice, rightful authority, and unified allegiance, a vision of kingship that threatened not just Sauron's physical army, but the very metaphysical foundation of his dark, self-serving logic, resulting in the irreversible prioritization of the completely wrong enemy. Why did the Dark Lord fixate on the spectral reflection of Isildur's past, manifesting dreadfully in Aragorn, the uncrowned heir, whose very bloodline held the shocking and visceral memory of Sauron's ultimate humiliation, ignoring the subtle, insidious creep of true oblivion, moving silently through the deep shadows of his own domain? Delve into the terrifying psychology of a millennia-old being paralyzed by the recurring trauma of human legitimacy. Unravel the chilling paradox of Andúril, the reforged blade of the West, which was not merely steel, but a devastating, spectral echo of ancient defeat, serving as the physical manifestation of Sauron's deepest terror. Explore how the return of this fragmented sword in Aragorn's hand dictated the entire dark strategy of Mordor, focusing the eye upon a symbol while missing the critical, devastating reality of its impending ruin. Investigate the shocking strategic miscalculation of the Shadow. Sauron feared not the raw destructive power of Istari or the ancient light of an elf queen, but the quiet, undeniable political legitimacy embodied by Aragorn, understanding that a united realm under a true king represented an existential, self-sustaining threat that raw dark magic alone could never truly extinguish, a fear rooted in the stability of hope. detailed the profound, almost incomprehensible horror Sauron faced in Aragorn's refusal to claim the One Ring, a shockingly alien concept to the Dark Lord's logic, exploring how this act of supreme self-denial, a ghost of virtue in a world defined by greed, rendered the rightful king unpredictable and exponentially more dangerous than any rival who would eagerly embrace the inevitable corruption of power. Describe the terrifying premonition that consumed Sauron's consciousness, the inescapable conviction that Aragorn's return was not just a military maneuver, but a cosmic reset, the fulfillment of a dark, cyclical prophecy wherein the line of Isildur was destined to return and complete the ancient act of separation, rendering all of Mordor's current power an ephemeral, temporary illusion of permanence. Analyze the fatal flaw in Sauron's magnificent, calculating intellect, his utter inability to comprehend that the greatest threat to absolute dominion would not arise from a powerful rival seeking to seize control, but from an insignificant vessel dedicated entirely to the shocking and illogical act of total annihilation, using Aragorn as the deliberate, dazzling distraction in the theater of war. Explore the esoteric dread imposed by the Dunedain bloodline flowing through Aragorn's veins, a shocking spiritual pollutant to the Dark Lord, representing the unconquered will of ancient Numenor, a power that transcended physical combat and threatened to unravel the very foundations of Mordor's spiritual and temporal influence simply by asserting its legitimate, uncorrupted existence. Explicate how Sauron, blinded by his own eternal, consuming avarice, projected his profound hunger for the ring onto Aragorn, thereby magnifying the king's potential threat tenfold and confirming his own self-fulfilling prophecy, tragically failing to recognize the simple, devastating truth that power desired is controllable, but power utterly renounced is the key to absolute, unpredicted doom. Detail the catastrophic fear Sauron harbored regarding Aragorn's unique power to unify disparate, war-torn peoples, a synthesis far more perilous than any spell, as the Dark Lord understood instinctively that the convergence of men, elves, and dwarves under a legitimate king's banner created an impenetrable, spiritually fortified barrier against the spread of the Shadow's pervasive, divisive influence. Construct a narrative focusing on the subterranean terror Sauron felt, knowing that if Aragorn, the intended rightful claimant, ever wielded the ring, he would become a tyrant of light, a perfectly mirrored, terrifyingly effective inversion of Sauron himself, making the ensuing war a horrific zero-sum conflict where even victory would result in a devastatingly similar form of absolute, relentless oppression. Describe the horrifying vision that haunted the Dark Lord's eye. Aragorn, crowned not just in Minas Tirith, but wielding the ring as the ultimate political seal, establishing an unassailable global authority based on ancestral right, a shocking scene of legitimate sovereignty that threatened to overwrite Mordor's fabricated dominion with a permanence that only divine sanction and historical precedence could bestow. Investigate how the ancient, unhealed scar left by Isildur in the Second Age dictated Sauron's entire defensive posture in the Third, causing him to obsessively misidentify Aragorn, the living embodiment of that trauma, as the definitive threat, thereby fatally misallocating his vigilance and allowing the true, minuscule agents of final, irreversible destruction to pass unseen into the fiery heart of doom. The Dark Lord's dread was not of raw magical power, but of the chilling specter of resurrected legitimacy. Aragorn,
heir to Isildur, carried the very wound that felled Sauron millennia ago, a continuous, agonizing reminder of mortal success, suggesting that the true horror was a righteous king wielding the ultimate evil against its creator, a conceptual horror transcending mere military might. Consider the deeper meaning of Andúril, the reforged blade of the West, a weapon not merely of steel, but of unforgiving memory. Every gleam of its fire was a psychic assault on Sauron, whispering the prophecy of recurring defeat, confirming the unbearable possibility that the rightful king could rise, unify the shattered realms, and wield the supreme power, not through corruption, but through terrifying, justified destiny. The truly paralyzing vision for the Master of Shadows was the terrifying prospect of unity. Not a wizard or an elf queen, but a human king, Aragorn, whose bloodline held the keys to mass allegiance, making the One Ring an unstoppable political seal, capable of welding fractured kingdoms into an unbreakable, luminous bulwark, threatening Mordor with the return of a terrifying, unified age of men. Unravel the cryptic terror that seized the Dark Lord when contemplating Aragorn. The inherent risk was not that Aragorn would be corrupted like Saruman, but that he possessed the unique, horrific right to claim the ring by blood legacy, potentially transforming its boundless evil into an instrument of absolute, divinely sanctioned justice. A horrifying irony that broke Sauron's cynical logic of power. Delve into the chilling strategic blunder. Sauron's profound focus on Aragorn as the singular, inevitable claimant, the shining, dangerous lure, was the ultimate manifestation of his own arrogant blindness, causing him to completely miss the creeping, insignificant, yet world-shattering threat moving silently through the shadows, demonstrating that often the most potent mysteries hide in plain sight among the utterly powerless.
What spectral dread possessed the ancient spirit? It was the profound, suffocating fear of historical repetition. Aragorn was the living embodiment of Isildur's unexpected triumph, a cyclical curse promising that the dominion established by terror could be utterly undone by the resurgence of legitimate, ancestral power, making the Ranger's very existence a chilling, inescapable metaphysical threat to Sauron's eternal claim. The shocking mystery lies in the Ranger's unparalleled, disciplined rejection of the ultimate temptation. Sauron, unable to comprehend free will untainted by greed, saw Aragorn's calculated restraint as an unknown, terrifying variable, a form of power far surpassing raw magic, suggesting that the greatest threat was not the potential misuse of the ring, but the terrifying capability to utterly refuse it. Explore the shadow mathematics of tyranny. Sauron calculated that Gandalf lacked the throne and Galadriel lacked the ambition, but Aragorn possessed the crown of ancient lineage, rendering the ring a catalyst for immediate, unassailable global governance, a horrifying rapid escalation of threat that bypassed all traditional defenses and promised the swift, catastrophic end of Mordor's long-prepared strategic timeline. Ponder the haunting agony Narsil inflicted upon the Dark Lord's psyche, how its reforged state, Andúril, represented a psychic weapon wielded by Aragorn, eternally reminding Sauron of his deepest humiliation, and the possibility that the same exact instrument of failure would herald a second, final destruction, a persistent, chilling echo of doom across the black plains of Mordor. Analyze the terrifying disruption Aragorn caused within Sauron's flawlessly cruel logic, where the Dark Lord only saw the insatiable thirst for dominion. Aragorn offered the inexplicable, unsettling possibility of righteous self-sacrifice, defying the fundamental rules of power that Sauron had built his millennia-long reign upon, making him an unpredictable, profoundly mysterious threat to the very order of darkness. Investigate the hidden terror embedded in Aragorn's charismatic leadership, a capability far more insidious than orc armies, which could effortlessly gather fragmented human loyalties under a single, legitimate banner, creating a unified martial force backed by the moral authority of the ancient kings, transforming the War of the Ring into a sudden, devastating war of existential legitimacy against the Shadow. Unveil the shocking prophetic dimension of Aragorn's return. Sauron viewed him less as a physical enemy and more as a manifestation of fate's cruelest joke, a destined harbinger of the final age of light, a looming shadow of hope that, armed with the ring, could instantly validate every ancient prophecy and permanently excise the stain of Mordor from the map of existence, sealing the Dark Lord's fate.
Unveil the clandestine terror gripping the Dark Lord's consciousness. It wasn't the blazing sorcery of the Istari, nor the ancient light of the Eldar that truly paralyzed him, but the spectral persistence of Isildur's bloodline, a chilling, genealogical curse whispering of past defeats and promising a calamitous future where the stolen authority would be ruthlessly reclaimed by a wandering ghost wearing the guise of a ranger, a return defying all logic of shadow. Probe the agonizing dread woven into the very structure of Barad-dûr, where Sauron's eye fixed obsessively upon Andúril, the reforged blade, knowing it was not mere steel, but a searing, sentient memory of his greatest humiliation, a lethal artifact of legitimacy capable of cleaving through the mystical veil of his dominion, embodying a destiny that demanded his absolute eradication by a righteous hand that refused to be tempted by the very power Sauron intended to wield. Describe the ultimate, unthinkable nightmare for the Master of Lies, the shocking realization that Aragorn possessed the inherent, terrifying gift not of raw might, but of spiritual magnetism, an unsettling charisma that could mend the fractured will of men, elves, and dwarves, creating an irresistible political and military singularity, a unified West that would turn the tide of ages, proving that hope, when organized under a true king, was infinitely more destructive than any solitary ring-bearer's power lust. Delve into the unfathomable paradox that shattered the Dark Lord's carefully calculated reality. Why did the single individual with the most incontestable right and strength to claim the ultimate weapon steadfastly refuse its grasp, revealing a dangerous inner fortress of morality that existed utterly outside Sauron's comprehension of avarice and control, making Aragorn an unpredictable void in the calculus of fear, capable of unimaginable self-denial? Illuminate the subterranean horror of Sauron recognizing that Aragorn, the true king, embodied the possibility of a righteous, enduring imperium built on loyalty rather than terror, an inversion of his own dark design so profound and stable that it threatened to render Mordor's rule not just defeated, but irrelevant. A chilling prospect, far worse than facing a rival tyrant seeking merely to replace him. Investigate the terrifying convergence of forgotten prophecy and impending fate, where the reemergence of the Dunedain line signaled an epical shift foreseen by ancient powers, suggesting a celestial decree that the age of men, led by this specific, uncanny heir, was predetermined to violently eclipse the age of shadow, a horrifying inevitability Sauron fought against with desperate, failing fury.
Analyzed the clandestine terror generated by Aragorn's silent, overwhelming symbolic authority. He was less a physical warrior and more a walking testament to ancient law and recovered sovereignty, a living icon whose very existence negated Sauron's illegal claim to Middle-earth, transforming every skirmish into a referendum on legitimate rule, and ensuring that his eventual crowning would trigger the spiritual collapse of Mordor. Expose the chilling continuity of vengeance represented by Aragorn, who carried not just royal blood, but the collective memory of Númenórean strength and wisdom, a relentless, millennia-spanning generational threat that Sauron could never truly extinguish, a perpetual motion of defiance that ensured the king's return was always the most inevitable and feared event in the entire timeline of the Second Darkness. Detail the profound, fatal error of Sauron's calculated focus. His obsession with the legitimate, shining threat of Aragorn served as the perfect, blinding spectacle, drawing the eye's absolute gaze, while the true, microscopic peril, the unseen vulnerability embodied by the insignificant hobbits, crept silently through the shadows to deliver the shattering blow to the foundations of his eternal dominion. Contemplate how Sauron projected his own deepest, most primal fear of ultimate, legitimate overthrow onto Aragorn, creating a magnified, almost mythological rival whose potential to unify the world and wield the ring with righteous and thus unassailable authority became the central strategic node of Mordor's defense, thereby defining the very terms of his eventual destruction by focusing entirely on the wrong kind of strength. Unravel the esoteric reason Sauron feared the Ranger more than the Wizard. Gandalf and Galadriel represented cosmic or magical power, entities Sauron could conceptually grasp and potentially counter, whereas Aragorn embodied the terrifying, grounded threat of legitimate human authority backed by blood and destiny, a historical force that had already defeated him once and proved inherently immune to the corrupting subtleties of shadow. Chronicle the moment the Dark Lord's absolute, self-referential logic of power began to collapse. Aragorn's existence was a direct violation of Sauron's core belief that all great beings must desire control, demonstrating a unique, devastating form of strength rooted in self-mastery and humility, an alien concept that rendered Mordor's intricate schemes and vast military might suddenly, shockingly meaningless against an enemy driven by self-sacrificial duty rather than greed.
Unveil the shocking truth behind the Dark Lord's paralyzing dread. It was not merely the resurgence of ancient kingship that terrified him, but the silent, shimmering threat of Andúril, the reforged blade of the West, a weapon saturated with the memory of his absolute downfall, serving as a cruel, blazing reminder that failure was possible, and that legitimacy, backed by that lethal sliver of fate, posed an existential, metaphysical danger no sorcery could truly counter. Investigate the profound, occult reason Sauron considered Aragorn the prime threat, recognizing that while Gandalf or Galadriel might wield the ring to become powerful tyrants of light, only Aragorn possessed the inherent, legitimate right and charismatic pull to unify the fractured nations of men, transforming the One Ring from a tool of individual corruption into an unstoppable, continent-spanning political mandate capable of smothering Mordor beneath a deluge of unified free will. Describe the darkly ironic miscalculation rooted in Sauron's obsession with high kingship and visible might, detailing how his fixation on Aragorn, the legitimate, obvious rival, created a profound, blinding shadow that deliberately obscured the minuscule, almost invisible threat of the Hobbit carrying the ring through the back gate of his dominion, revealing a deep flaw in the Dark Lord's absolute, power-centric logic. Explore the terrifying paradox that shattered Sauron's comprehension. Aragorn, the only man with the ancestral right and inherent strength to successfully claim and use the One Ring to restore the glorious human kingdoms, chose instead the agonizing path of refusal and self-denial, an act of moral power so utterly alien to the Dark Lord's nature that it registered as an unpredictable, destabilizing force far more dangerous than any direct challenge. Conjure the horrifying vision that haunted the timeless nightmares of the Dark Lord,
the specter of the last alliance rising again, commanded by a king whose return heralded not just war, but the inevitable, systematic eradication of the shadow, making Aragorn less a mortal enemy and more a living, breathing harbinger of an ancient, successful prophecy of ultimate historical defeat. Unravel the cryptic understanding Sauron held regarding Aragorn's authority. The Dark Lord feared Gandalf's magic and Galadriel's light, but he harbored a deeper terror for Aragorn's power to inspire uncoerced loyalty and hope among the free peoples, realizing that a kingdom built on voluntary devotion was fundamentally stronger and more resistant to dark influence than any dominion erected purely through terror and chains.
Chart the horrifying sequence of events foretold in Forgotten Scrolls that convinced Sauron of Aragorn's destiny as his greatest nemesis, suggesting that the Dark Lord was not reacting to current threats, but desperately maneuvering to prevent the fulfillment of an ancient, world-shattering prophecy tied to the reappearance of Isildur's bloodline wielding the sacred, reforged sword of Doom, Andúril. Detail the calculated, yet tragically flawed, strategic function Aragorn served in the War of the Ring, where his brilliant, unifying presence and legitimate threat acted as a cosmic, blinding flash, drawing the full infernal gaze of Sauron's eye and all the resources of Mordor away from the true, minuscule vulnerability, the path of fire taken by the Ring-bearer, thereby facilitating the destruction through misdirection. Analyze the devastating, inexplicable flaw in Sauron's fundamental worldview, the inability to conceive of any sentient being willingly rejecting the ultimate prize of absolute dominance, leading him to obsessively monitor Aragorn, who might claim it, while completely dismissing the notion of a simple creature choosing sacrifice over sovereignty, a philosophical chasm that sealed the Dark Lord's fate. Examine the chilling hubris of the Dark Lord, whose millennia of experience dealing only with massive power structures caused him to utterly disregard the capacity for heroism residing in the humble, the overlooked, and the unthreatening, cementing his focus on the grand conflict with Aragorn and fatally ensuring that the single, most critical vulnerability of his entire demonic enterprise went utterly unnoticed until the final, shocking moment of incineration. Define the ultimate, shockingly mysterious irony of the One Ring's existence. Forged to secure Sauron's absolute, eternal mastery over the world, it paradoxically became the most feared object in his possession when facing the one man, Aragorn, who could wield its power with legitimate authority and rally the entire world against him, thereby turning the instrument of control into the catalyst for his deepest ancestral dread and final downfall. Delve into the chilling psychological residue of Isildur's ancient victory, exploring how the very essence of Aragorn's bloodline, an echo of the catastrophic wound inflicted upon the Dark Lord millennia ago, became a phantom terror far greater than the obvious magical might of the Istari, manifesting as a festering, unhealable trauma within the Eye of Mordor that demanded catastrophic preemptive action. Shockingly mysterious, detail the terrifying psychological resonance that Aragorn, the embodiment of Isildur's bloodline and the spectral memory of defeat, held over Sauron, exploring why the Dark Lord's absolute confidence in his dominion fractured whenever the possibility of a legitimate, unifying king wielding the One Ring arose, rather than a mere usurper driven by singular ambition or raw magical might. Shockingly mysterious. Investigate the esoteric link between the reforged blade Andúril, the ancient seal of Númenórean authority, and Sauron's deepest existential terror, illustrating how this symbol of unbroken royal legitimacy, coupled with Aragorn's disciplined refusal to succumb to the ring's immediate temptation, presented a systemic threat to Mordor far more profound than the raw power possessed by the Istari or the Elven Queens. Shockingly mysterious. Imagine the chilling alternate reality where Aragorn claims the One Ring out of duty rather than greed, scrutinizing how Sauron perceived the unparalleled peril of a truly righteous tyrant, a king of men who wielded the instrument of absolute evil to forge absolute good, thereby creating a unified adversary realm that the Dark Lord's calculated philosophy of corruption could never comprehend or defeat. Shockingly mysterious, unveiled the profound error in Sauron's strategic calculus, explaining the dark irony of why he prioritized the magnificent, visible threat of Aragorn's political resurgence and royal claim above all other dangers, completely failing to detect the creeping, unseen spiritual defiance manifested by the humble, utterly power-rejecting nature of the hobbits advancing toward the fiery chasm. Shockingly mysterious, described the chilling vision Sauron must have had of Aragorn, crowned in Minas Tirith with the ring adorning his hand, instantly commanding the total, loyal allegiance of elves, dwarves, and men, creating a unified martial and moral bulwark that superseded the Dark Lord's divide-and-conquer strategy, proving that legitimate hope was a more dangerous weapon than pure domination. Shockingly mysterious. Elaborate on how Aragorn served as a living, breathing historical haunting for Sauron, not merely a contemporary rival, but a direct, agonizing iteration of the past trauma inflicted by the last alliance, constantly reminding the Dark Lord that his previous fall originated specifically from the potent combination of human kingship and celestial intervention. Shockingly mysterious. Differentiate the quality of fear Sauron felt towards Gandalf's ephemeral, divine wisdom versus Aragorn's tangible, dynastic authority, speculating why the Dark Lord concluded that earthly hereditary legitimacy, coupled with the ring's political weight, posed a more immediate and structural danger to his eternal ambition than the unpredictable cosmic interventions of the Istari. Shockingly mysterious. Investigate the utter cognitive dissonance Sauron experienced regarding Aragorn's capacity for self-denial. How could the ultimate power source be deliberately refused by the one person with the most legitimate historical claim to wield it, revealing the fatal flaw in the Dark Lord's universe, which could only process ambition and consumption, never sacrifice?
Shockingly mysterious. Analyze Aragorn's ultimate, unintended role as the blinding distraction, the glorious, heroic lightning rod that absorbed all of Sauron's strategic focus, allowing the truly critical, unseen maneuver, the destruction of the source of all power, to proceed in the shadows, highlighting the spectacular failure of the Dark Lord's hyper-focus on conventional power structures. Shockingly mysterious, delineate the nuanced political terror Aragorn represented. While others threatened magical strength, Aragorn menaced the very foundation of Mordor's rule by offering a credible, unifying alternative government supported by ancient right and public loyalty, transforming the One Ring from a magical artifact into the unchallengeable seal of a resurrected opposition empire. Shockingly mysterious, contrast the sheer physical strength of Saruman or Boromir, whom Sauron understood and could manipulate, against Aragorn's unsettling moral authority and inherited duty, detailing why this quiet, internal resistance to corruption, combined with his unique lineage, rendered him an unpredictable variable that defied the Dark Lord's established rules of domination and enslavement.
shockingly mysterious, examine the crippling psychological blow delivered to Sauron when he realized his grand, millennia-spanning strategy, focused entirely on neutralizing the great kings and wizards like Aragorn, was undone by the sheer lack of desire for power exhibited by the least significant of creatures, proving that his absolute adherence to the logic of control was the very mechanism of his demise. The chilling revelation hidden in the darkest chambers of Barad-dûr was the staggering truth that Sauron's deepest dread lay not in magical confrontation with the Istari, but in the potential return of Aragorn, the rightful king, whose mere bloodline represented a historical mandate and legitimate authority capable of forging an unbreakable coalition of free peoples, transforming the ring into a horrifying symbol of just governance that Sauron could never comprehend or break. Delve into the arcane horror of the Dark Lord's mind, dissecting why the reforged Narsil, now Andúril, haunted his eternal nightmares more fiercely than any siege weapon, representing the catastrophic cycle of defeat initiated by Isildur, and proving that the legitimate sovereignty embodied by Aragorn possessed the shocking power to shatter the political reality of Mordor completely. Explore the shocking psychological paradox that consumed the Eye of Mordor, forcing Sauron to perceive the quiet, diminutive hobbit as utterly irrelevant, focusing instead on the magnificent, politically dangerous return of Aragorn, the crowned rival whose anticipated move to claim the ring was a projection of Sauron's own insatiable lust for absolute, legitimate dominion. The chilling revelation hidden in the darkest chambers of Barad-dûr was the staggering truth that Sauron's deepest dread lay not in magical confrontation with the Istari, but in the potential return of Aragorn, the rightful king, whose mere bloodline represented a historical mandate and legitimate authority, capable of forging an unbreakable coalition of free peoples, transforming the ring into a horrifying symbol of just governance that Sauron could never comprehend or break. Delve into the arcane horror of the Dark Lord's mind, dissecting why the reforged Narsil, now Andúril, haunted his eternal nightmares more fiercely than any siege weapon, representing the catastrophic cycle of defeat initiated by Isildur, and proving that the legitimate sovereignty embodied by Aragorn possessed the shocking power to shatter the political reality of Mordor completely. Explore the shocking psychological paradox that consumed the Eye of Mordor, forcing Sauron to perceive the quiet, diminutive hobbit as utterly irrelevant, focusing instead on the magnificent, politically dangerous return of Aragorn, the crowned rival, whose anticipated move to claim the ring was a projection of Sauron's own insatiable lust for absolute, legitimate dominion.
Unveil the sinister calculus that dictated Sauron's strategic prioritization, realizing the unparalleled menace posed by Aragorn stemmed from the staggering potential of combining the ring's absolute corruption with incontestable royal legitimacy, creating a terrifying king of the West whose unifying power would instantaneously extinguish the flickering hope held by the divided free peoples. Analyze the dark symmetry within Sauron's hierarchy of terror, scrutinizing why the ephemeral threat of elvish magic or the predictable ambition of Saruman paled against the tangible, shocking danger presented by Aragorn, the leader capable of converting the ring not merely into a weapon of war, but into an undisputed, morally validated engine for forging a perpetual kingdom of man. Ponder the agonizing strategies Sauron employed to counter the impending, horrifying reunification of the realms of men under the banner of the Dunedain heir, a political maneuver by Aragorn that, if paired with the One Ring, would have instantaneously dissolved the fear-based structure of Mordor's influence and created an irreversible, shocking paradigm shift in Middle-earth's power balance. Scrutinize the inexplicable dread Sauron felt concerning Aragorn's profound ability for self-abnegation. The deliberate refusal of the ring by the man who had the strongest ancestral right to claim it represented a shocking, fundamental rejection of the Dark Lord's entire philosophy of power, making Aragorn's pure will a terrifying anomaly beyond Mordor's understanding. Explain the catastrophic tactical failure rooted in Sauron's obsession. Aragorn served as the perfect, radiant lure, drawing the entire focused wrath of Mordor onto the battlefields of men, while the true, quiet, and profoundly unexpected threat marched through the shadows toward Mount Doom, sealing the shocking demise of the Dark Lord through sheer misdirection. Penetrate the dark historical truth that terrified the Great Eye, revealing that Aragorn's power was less about martial strength and more about the unholy scar left by Isildur. This bloodline ensured that Aragorn's eventual coronation represented a spiritual, legitimate reset of history, a shocking and irreversible revocation of Sauron's millennia-long claim to Middle-earth. Describe the horrifying existential threat that Aragorn posed simply by existing. The potential for a united West under a legitimate, powerful king meant that the fragmented human resistance would consolidate into an unstoppable, cohesive force, presenting a shocking political stability that was the absolute antithesis of Sauron's calculated strategy of fear and isolation.
Analyze the chilling dread associated with the empty throne of Gondor. Sauron understood that its vacancy was a temporary respite, and the moment Aragorn occupied it, the resulting tide of political, military, and spiritual legitimacy would launch a shocking, irreversible holy war against Mordor, validating the end of the Dark Lord's second reign. Detail the profound, shocking flaw in Sauron's dark intellect. His inability to process humility meant he always prioritized the threat of Aragorn, the legitimate claimant who might seize power, completely missing the quiet, terrifying maneuver of the hobbits, whose plan for destruction defied the very premise of power that Mordor was built upon. Unravel the cryptic truth buried within Mordor's annals. Why did the omnipresent Dark Lord, Sauron, tremble not at the luminous might of Istari or the ancient wisdom of elven queens, but before the mere legitimacy of Aragorn, a ranger whose bloodline echoed the unbearable historical trauma of Isildur's original triumph and the cutting shame of the broken Narsil reforged? Trace the sinister logic of the shadow. If the One Ring guarantees absolute power, why was Sauron fundamentally paralyzed by Aragorn's refusal to claim it, viewing this unimaginable act of self-denial as a more profound existential threat than the ambition of Saruman or the sheer power of Galadriel, suggesting a secret code of resistance the Dark Lord could not comprehend? Penetrate the veil surrounding Andúril, the Flame of the West, and articulate the dark magic of fear it cast upon Sauron. This blade was not merely a weapon, but the resurrected phantom of Isildur's successful revolt, a blazing, agonizing reminder that the Dark Lord's physical form had once been humbled by the line Aragorn carried, confirming the possibility of history repeating its catastrophic sequence. Revealed the clandestine truth that Sauron feared the unification of men under a legitimate king, Aragorn, far more than any magical confrontation. Understanding that a realm built on freely given allegiance, strengthened by the ring's power and sanctioned by ancient legitimacy, represented a systemic stability that could nullify Mordor's entire political infrastructure of terror and division. Explore the chilling irony of Sauron's hubris. How did the majestic, unfathomable threat of the returning king, Aragorn, function as the perfect, radiant diversion, ensuring that the all-seeing eye remained fixated on the glorious potential claimant, while the true, unthinkable vulnerability, the silent, insignificant hobbit, slipped tragically past the boundaries of the Dark Lord's profound power calculus? Decipher the hidden hierarchy of fear within Mordor. Why was the concept of legitimate kingship, embodied by Aragorn and his divine right to rule over both Gondor and Arnor, inherently more disturbing to Sauron than the ancient, raw power wielded by Galadriel, suggesting that the Dark Lord found political, unified order a deeper antithesis to his chaotic tyranny than pure magical strength? Speculate on the terrifying counter-reality where Aragorn, having claimed the One Ring, transforms it instantly from an artifact of dark magic into the ultimate political seal, revealing Sauron's latent fear that the ring, in the hands of the rightful heir, could become an instrument of sacred, binding legitimacy, thus permanently enshrining the defeat of Mordor through an indisputable heavenly mandate. Probe the chilling vacuum in Sauron's soul. How did the Dark Lord's absolute inability to fathom moral self-restraint or principled sacrifice make Aragorn, the man who could take the ring but chose not to, the single most incomprehensible and therefore fatal variable in the entire conflict, proving that true strength lay in the abandonment of the very power Sauron craved? Investigate the esoteric distinction Sauron drew between Boromir's easily corrupted, passionate ambition and Aragorn's disciplined, ancient legitimacy, uncovering why the Dark Lord dismissed the localized threat of a desperate human captain while obsessing over the dynastic permanence Aragorn represented, a haunting echo of the Númenórean power that shattered the Dark Lord millennia prior. Describe the suffocating psychological weight that Aragorn's very being exerted upon Sauron, revealing that the Dark Lord's fear was profoundly personal, a terror rooted in the perpetual resurrection of ancient pain and the relentless, whispered promise that the line of Ildor would finally erase all of Mordor's accomplishments, confirming a hidden vulnerability deeper than any fortress wall. Dissect the fatal arrogance inherent in Sauron's logic of power, wherein the Dark Lord's overwhelming certainty that the ring must inevitably be wielded by a figure of historical significance, namely Aragorn, created a strategic black hole, drawing all attention away from the unthinkable pathway of destruction, sealing Mordor's fate through intellectual rigidness. Describe the suffocating psychological weight that Aragorn's very being exerted upon Sauron, revealing that the Dark Lord's fear was profoundly personal, a terror rooted in the perpetual resurrection of ancient pain, and the relentless, whispered promise that the line of Ildor would finally erase all of Mordor's accomplishments, confirming a hidden vulnerability deeper than any fortress wall. Dissect the fatal arrogance inherent in Sauron's logic of power, wherein the Dark Lord's overwhelming certainty that the ring must inevitably be wielded by a figure of historical significance, namely Aragorn, created a strategic black hole, drawing all attention away from the unthinkable pathway of destruction, sealing Mordor's fate through intellectual rigidness.
Ponder the dark hypothesis. Did Sauron secretly fear Aragorn less as a conqueror and more as the potential architect of a flawless, righteous empire enabled by the ring, a tyranny of perfect order that would forever extinguish the need for shadow, rendering Mordor's chaotic influence obsolete, a dread far surpassing the messy ambition of a fallen wizard? Unveil the shocking psychological truth. Sauron's greatest terror was not the might of ancient wizards or elven queens, but the specter of history repeating, specifically the cursed lineage of Isildur, the shadow of a forgotten king who could reclaim the shattered fragments of Narsil and unite realms, possessing the unique, terrifying right of inheritance that defied the Dark Lord's logic of conquest. Investigate the chilling strategic misjudgment. Why the Dark Lord Mordor fixated on Aragorn, the uncrowned wanderer, perceiving him as the ultimate threat,
because he bore the flame of Unduril, the sword of shattered memory, symbolizing the potential for a unified human kingdom under legitimate rule, a political resurrection far more corrosive to Sauron's dominion than any isolated act of pure magic. Describe the profound, inexplicable terror gripping the Eye of Mordor when contemplating Aragorn, the shocking reality that the true danger lay not in overwhelming arcane power, but in the subtle, unforgivable possibility of moral authority combined with royal blood, a combination that could turn the free peoples into an unbreakable bulwark, defying the fundamental axioms of fear upon which Sauron built his eternal empire. Investigate the terrifying inversion of power, where Sauron realized the One Ring, if claimed by Aragorn, would transform from a tool of chaotic tyranny into a seal of terrifying legitimacy, granting the heir of Isildur an undeniable, universally accepted authority to forge a cohesive Western realm, a scenario of structured resistance that utterly horrified the Master of Shadows more than any sorcerer's defiance. Analyze the shocking paradox of Aragorn's strength, his terrifying refusal to take the ring, a choice that baffled and ultimately terrified Sauron, who could only comprehend ambition and greed. This unnerving humility, combined with his royal claim, rendered him an unpredictable variable outside the Dark Lord's established calculus of corruption, marking him as a unique existential threat. Detail the devastating strategic blindness of the Dark Lord, focused entirely on neutralizing the rising king of men, Aragorn, whose luminous threat served as the perfect, shocking decoy, diverting all of Mordor's dreadful scrutiny away from the true, minuscule agents of doom, the seemingly insignificant, unarmed carriers of the ring who crept silently through the shadowed wastes toward the fiery heart of fate.
Synthesize the chilling prophetic fear embedded in Sauron's ancient memory. The return of the king was not merely a military concern, but the spiritual and political reversal of his entire legacy, manifesting through Aragorn, who, wielding the reforged symbol of past defeat, threatened to usher in an era of unity and light that Sauron deemed metaphysically impossible under the eternal reign of shadow and discord. Compare Aragorn's unique and shocking danger to that posed by Gandalf and Galadriel. While the others possessed raw power and wisdom, Aragorn held the terrifying, inherent right to rule and unify disparate peoples, making the ring in his hand not just stronger magic, but an unstoppable political mandate that would destroy the structure of fear Sauron had meticulously crafted over millennia. Reveal the shocking psychological trauma endured by Sauron, the inescapable terror that Aragorn, as Isildur's living echo, possessed the singular, legitimate justification to wield the weapon that had already caused the Dark Lord's catastrophic downfall, guaranteeing that history could repeat itself with horrifying clarity and finality under the banner of the restored West. Analyze the profound, mysterious power contained within the blade Unduril, the flame of the West, which was far more than mere enchanted steel to Sauron. It was the shockingly visible testament to his failure, a burning symbol of continuity and rightful kingship that, when held by Aragorn, magnified the threat of dynastic renewal into an insurmountable ideological challenge that overshadowed armies and fortresses. Detail the specific, chilling ability Aragorn possessed that terrified Sauron most, the political genius to bridge the historical divides between men, elves, and dwarves, using his kingly status and charisma to form a cohesive, unstoppable alliance. This potential for unity, weaponized by the ring,
represented a systemic threat that Sauron's isolationist strategy was utterly unprepared to confront. Provide a shockingly deep analysis of Sauron's fatal flaw, his inability to grasp strength outside the confines of pure domination, causing him to misinterpret Aragorn's moral restraint as mere latent ambition, thus elevating the threat of the uncrowned king to an obsessional level, while the true, subtle danger of self-sacrifice and rejection of power, embodied by the hobbits, moved undetected toward the Inferno. Unveil the shocking secret dwelling within the black heart of Mordor. Why Sauron, the architect of fear and master of the shadows, truly feared the lineage of Isildur, seeing in the unassuming ranger Aragorn not just a threat of steel, but the spectral embodiment of ancient conquering legitimacy, a terrifying possibility where the West would unite under a rightful, terrible crown destined to shatter his millennia-old dominion.
Delve into the enigmatic truth behind the Dark Lord's fixation on a single mortal man. It was the gleaming terror of Andúril, the blade reforged, that pierced his ethereal sight, a shocking, palpable wound from the distant past, signifying the dreadful continuum of history and the undeniable, horrifying likelihood that a king, legally mandated by fate, would once again tear the very fabric of his tyrannical existence asunder. Analyze the cryptic vulnerability of the ultimate tyrant. Sauron's strategic error was his shocking miscalculation that the political union of the West, forged under the ancient, unchallenged authority of Aragorn's royal blood, posed a far greater systemic threat to eternal darkness than any wizard's staff or elven light. A unified crown was the one specter that truly haunted the towers of Barad-dûr, defying the logic of mere sorcery. Explore the terrifying paradox that paralyzed the Dark Lord, the shocking, incomprehensible truth that Aragorn, the only man with the legitimate right and inherent strength to claim the One Ring, chose instead the path of self-denial, making him a mysterious, utterly unpredictable force that defied Sauron's fundamental understanding of desire and conquest, shattering the predictable calculus of ultimate power. Witness the chilling revelation that Aragorn was the ultimate shocking manifestation of Sauron's deepest historical trauma, not just a warrior, but the living, breathing curse of Isildur, perpetually signaling the inevitable collapse of the Shadow. His destined ascension to the thrones of Gondor and Arnor represented the terrifying, unified revival of Númenórean glory, which alone held the blueprint for Mordor's total, agonizing erasure. Investigate the profound, shocking strategic deception. Aragorn, the majestic scion of kings, served as the ultimate, necessary distraction, a brilliant light upon the battlefield that fully engrossed the eye of Sauron, tragically fixated on the anticipated clash of crowns, while the true, silent mechanism of destruction moved unnoticed in the darkest corners of the land, fulfilling an unknown, deeply mysterious purpose. Uncover the shocking mechanism of fear rooted in political authority. Sauron grasped that Aragorn's ancient, sacred legitimacy, bolstered by the power of the One Ring, would have instantly translated into a terrifying, unified military and spiritual alliance of men, elves, and dwarves, creating a seamless, incorruptible kingdom that defied all methods of magical coercion and infiltration, guaranteeing his final, systemic failure. Uncovered the shocking mechanism of fear rooted in political authority. Sauron grasped that Aragorn's ancient, sacred legitimacy, bolstered by the power of the One Ring, would have instantly translated into a terrifying, unified military and spiritual alliance of men, elves, and dwarves, creating a seamless, incorruptible kingdom that defied all methods of magical coercion and infiltration, guaranteeing his final, systemic failure.
Ponder the mysterious hierarchy of terror within Sauron's mind. Why were the ancient, overwhelming powers of the Istari van the Eldar deemed lesser threats than the destined return of a mortal king? The shocking conclusion is that only Aragorn possessed the inherent societal architecture, blood, destiny, and the legendary sword to forge permanent, institutional resistance, which was a far more terrifying, enduring doom than temporary magical opposition. Reveal the abyss of Sauron's self-deception. His obsessive focus on Aragorn as the expected usurper stemmed from a shocking psychological projection, believing the King of Men must inherently crave the ring as fiercely as he did, utterly failing to comprehend the mysterious moral fortitude that allowed Aragorn to look upon ultimate power and willfully turn away, a betrayal of the tyrant's deepest ideology. Analyze the cryptic significance of the shards. The reforging of Narsil into Andúril was the ultimate psychological shockwave sent through Barad-dûr, not merely a new sword, but a terrifying, conscious act of historical invocation. It symbolized the ancient, shocking memory of Sauron's own greatest failure, now held high by the legitimate claimant, confirming that the cycle of destruction was relentlessly beginning anew under the West's brightest hope. Gaze upon the dreadful, shocking twist of fate engineered by the West. Sauron's absolute, overwhelming focus on neutralizing the perceived threat of the returning king, Aragorn, was the crucial error that allowed the actual, minuscule harbinger of doom to slip through the fortified gates, proving that the Dark Lord's obsession with grand, legitimate power ultimately blinded him to the silent, mysteriously modest vessels of true self-sacrifice. Contemplate the dark philosophy of dominion. Why was the prospect of Aragorn's peaceful, legitimate reign a greater shock to Sauron than open warfare? Because the king represented the horrifying, palpable possibility of a united Middle-earth founded on hope, loyalty, and non-magical authority, a true, enduring antithesis to Mordor's foundation of fear, signifying the ultimate, inescapable failure of Sauron's entire millennia-old vision. Unveil the precise, dreadful calculus that led the Dark Lord Sauron to prioritize the destruction of Aragorn, the uncrowned heir of Isildur, over every other adversary. Explore the terrifying metaphysical consequence inherent in the reforging of Narsil into Andúril, a blade that whispered of a past defeat and promised an agonizing repetition of his greatest humiliation. Analyzing how this symbolic threat became a blinding obsession that masked the true, minuscule peril approaching his very doorstep in Mordor.
Detail the chilling psychological profile of Sauron, revealing why the concept of a unified kingdom of men, marshaled under the legitimate banner of Aragorn, proved a deeper, more existential horror than the overt magical power wielded by the Istari or the ancient light of the Elven Queen. Describe the dark prophecy inherent in Aragorn's mere existence, the catastrophic risk of a rival monarch using the One Ring not for personal ambition, but for the devastating legitimacy of unifying the West against him. Investigate the dreadful irony surrounding Aragorn's refusal to claim the One Ring, a calculated act of restraint that Sauron, trapped within his own logic of insatiable greed, could never fathom or anticipate. Explore the shocking consequence of this moral fortitude, where the single individual most justified in taking the ultimate power deliberately rejected it, thereby making him an unpredictable and uniquely terrifying variable in the Dark Lord's grand deterministic schema of conquest and eternal servitude. Analyze the shadowy reasons why Sauron deemed Gandalf, the ancient emissary of the West, a predictable opponent driven by defined principles, yet perceived Aragorn, the mortal ranger, as a chaotic, devastating force capable of shattering the very foundation of Mordor's rule. Scrutinize the hidden terror of genealogical persistence, where the bloodline of the king returned as a perpetual nightmare, signifying not just a temporary resistance, but the permanent termination of the Shadow's millennia-long dominion over Middle-earth. Elaborate on the terrifying nature of Aragorn as a political and symbolic weapon, far exceeding any magical artifact in Sauron's estimation. Depict the apocalyptic vision Sauron harbored, Aragorn, crowned in Minas Tirith, wielding the ring not as a destructive tyrant, but as a legitimate unifier, thereby forging an unbreakable societal and military bond among the free peoples, a fatal flaw in the Dark Lord's strategy, which depended solely on discord and despair to flourish unchecked. Describe the monumental fatal flaw in Sauron's omniscient strategic logic, his absolute, corrupted inability to perceive weakness as strength. Explore how his overwhelming focus on the grand, legitimate threat embodied by Aragorn, the king, the warrior, the heir, allowed the small, unassuming, and morally formidable hobbits to slip past the vigilant eye, perpetrating the ultimate act of destruction that he, in his arrogance, never calculated as possible or even worth guarding against.
Examine the deep historical trauma that Aragorn unconsciously triggered in Sauron's primordial consciousness. Detail how the reforged sword, Andúril, acted as a cruel physical manifestation of the defeat by Isildur at the climax of the Second Age, rendering the Dark Lord psychologically paralyzed by the cyclical nature of history and the recurring horror that his meticulously built power structure could collapse again under the banner of the rightful king. Illustrate the horrific possibility, from Sauron's perspective, that Aragorn might have used the One Ring under the guise of selfless, justified duty, transforming the ultimate instrument of malice into a shield of terrifying righteousness. Analyze why this specific use case, the combination of divine right, public loyalty, and absolute power, was infinitely more menacing to the Shadow than any ambition driven purely by conventional greed or thirst for domination, which Sauron could easily manipulate. Consider the unsettling fact that Sauron found Aragorn's sheer legitimacy unbearable. Delve into the psychological hell of knowing that the one person who could rightfully claim the allegiance of the entire Western world, backed by ancient lineage and a proven capacity for leadership, stood ready to challenge him, thereby invalidating his own self-proclaimed title as the ultimate ruler and reducing his millennia-long reign to a temporary, illegitimate occupation of Middle-earth. Explore the terrifying symbolic weight of the potential crown of Gondor resting on Aragorn's head, analyzing how this single political act, fortified by the possible possession of the ring, represented the total reversal of Sauron's long-term plan to dissolve the memory of the Númenórean kings. Describe the strategic imperative of eliminating this living symbol of defiance before the unification could solidify into an insurmountable and dreadfully effective military and spiritual counterforce. Detail the critical cognitive dissonance experienced by the Dark Lord, whose gaze was irrevocably fixed upon the dazzling, dangerous possibility of Aragorn seizing the ring, thus blinding him to the almost unthinkable path of destruction. Investigate the chilling reality that Sauron's profound misunderstanding of altruistic sacrifice and moral strength was the ultimate weapon used against him, transforming Aragorn into a necessary, magnificent decoy in the final catastrophic deception. Uncover the frightening reason Sauron could never truly break Aragorn. Aragorn's self-mastery and internal refusal to yield to temptation, which defied the Dark Lord's primary means of control, manipulation through ambition. Depict the profound terror of encountering a will that was not merely powerful, like Gandalf's, but fundamentally uncorruptible, making Aragorn a dark mirror reflecting the purity that Sauron had eternally lost and could never comprehend or neutralize.
Why did the eternal darkness quake? Not at the overwhelming magical might of the Istari or the blinding ancient radiance of the elven queens, but at the silent steps of an uncrowned king. Consider the profound metaphysical terror of a single lineage. Isildur's blood, a living curse upon the Dark Lord, resurrecting the very defeat that forged his millennia of vengeance. Explore the shockingly mysterious truth of Andúril, the blade reforged, which was not merely steel, but the tangible memory of Sauron's greatest humiliation, wielded by the only man who could unify the fractured kingdoms and claim the power of the West with undeniable, chilling legitimacy, thereby fulfilling the dark prophecy of his final return and catastrophic downfall. Unveil the shocking cognitive dissonance of the supreme manipulator, Sauron, whose strategy was fatally compromised by his inability to grasp the concept of refusal. He prepared meticulously for the titanic clash with Aragorn, the lawful heir, whose destiny demanded he seize the ring and wield it as a weapon of unified light, an ultimate rival born of ancient dread. Analyze why this fixation on the highest threat, the king who possessed the legitimacy and moral authority to forge an irresistible empire, forced him to completely overlook the clandestine, shadowy passage of the smallest creatures, those who understood that true strength lay not in claiming the cursed gold, but in the incomprehensible, self-annihilating act of its destruction, exposing the mysterious weakness at the core of absolute power. Unveil the chilling truth of Mordor's strategic error. Despite the boundless strength of the Dark Lord, his deepest, most agonizing fear was not the blinding light of the Maiar or the ancient wisdom of elven queens, but the specter of legitimate, unifying authority embodied by the uncrowned king, Aragorn, whose bloodline carried the venomous memory of Sauron's first devastating failure, a weakness entirely external to magic or sheer military might. Investigate the profound irony woven into the fabric of Sauron's defeat, a revelation that transcends brute force. The Dark Lord, obsessed with the monumental threat posed by the resurrected sword Andúril and the terrifying possibility of Isildur's heir wielding the One Ring as a tool of ultimate political legitimacy, was utterly blinded to the quiet, almost invisible march of two humble creatures who sought not to claim power, but to annihilate its very source. Explore the shocking calculation that led Sauron to view Aragorn as a more potent existential threat than Gandalf the White. The Dark Lord comprehended raw magical energy, but was paralyzed by the concept of unified human will, fearing that a rightful king could transform the ring from an artifact of individual dominance into an irresistible, legitimate seal of sovereignty, shattering Mordor's foundation built solely upon fear and division. Explore the shocking calculation that led Sauron to view Aragorn as a more potent existential threat than Gandalf the White. The Dark Lord comprehended raw magical energy, but was paralyzed by the concept of unified human will, fearing that a rightful king could transform the ring from an artifact of individual dominance into an irresistible, legitimate seal of sovereignty, shattering Mordor's foundation built solely upon fear and division. Delve into the abyss of Sauron's psychological warfare, examining why the potential ascension of a just, unified human king, a terrifying mirror image of Sauron's own desire for absolute dominion rooted in ancient right, paralyzed him far more profoundly than the temporary challenges posed by fleeting, powerful figures like Saruman or the passionate, fallible Boromir.
The most spine-chilling secret of Mordor's strategy lies in the realization that Sauron could conceptualize every form of corruption, from Saruman's treacherous ambition to Galadriel's incandescent temptation. But he possessed a fatal, horrifying inability to grasp the simple, potent concept of willing self-sacrifice, which ultimately rendered him incapable of anticipating the devastating, quiet rebellion of the Ringbearer. Disclose the terrifying weight of Aragorn's lineage. For Sauron, the heir of Isildur was not merely a man, but a living, breathing curse, a constantly present ghost of his greatest humiliation, symbolizing the unbearable truth that the shadow had once been physically broken by the race of men. A historical scar that Andúril, the reforged blade, threatened to reopen with terrifying, righteous finality. Ponder the chilling paradox that defined the War of the Ring. The glorious, visible return of the king was, in fact, the greatest deceptive spell cast upon Sauron, fixating his all-seeing eye upon a legitimate, powerful rival, while the true, microscopic vectors of destruction slipped unseen through the toxic landscape, achieving the unthinkable act of rejection. Analyze the subterranean horror gripping Sauron regarding the King of the West. The Dark Lord understood individual strength, but the specter of Aragorn meant the systematic re-establishment of a united, morally grounded realm that would turn the ring's power into a political instrument of irrevocable hope, a force that Mordor, being inherently fractured and reliant on terror, could never truly combat. Trace the silent terror that crept into Sauron's calculations, revealing that the true danger lay not in the claimed magic of the ring, but in the unimaginable integrity of the Dunedain heir. Aragorn's self-willed refusal to take the ultimate power became an unpredictable variable that defied the Dark Lord's rigid, power-hungry logic, making him an unknowable and thus horrifying opponent. Uncover the profound strategic blunder born of pride. Sauron's ingrained aristocratic contempt for the small folk ensured he completely discounted the possibility that the ring, his masterpiece of tyrannical temptation, could be carried with astonishing resilience by an unheralded hobbit, proving that humility, not heraldry or ancient might, was the only truly effective antidote to absolute evil. What chilling secret compelled Sauron to prioritize neutralizing Aragorn over all other threats? It was the profound recognition that only Aragorn possessed the triple synthesis: divine lineage, the symbol of ancient victory in Andúril, and the charisma to unify nations. A convergence capable of forging an indomitable global front that transcended localized resistance, promising not just temporary defeat, but the permanent extinguishing of the Shadow's reign. The most shocking revelation lies in the twisted psychology of the Dark Lord. Sauron feared the return of the king precisely because Aragorn represented the only plausible figure who could seize the One Ring and use it with moral authority, thus transforming Middle-earth into a rival, incorruptible superpower. A nightmare scenario where true kingship usurped the shadow of tyranny forever. Describe the insidious psychological mechanism by which Sauron, the architect of ultimate darkness, was paralyzed not by the raw power of the Istari or the ancient light of the Elven Queen, but by the profoundly unsettling legitimacy embodied in Aragorn, the spectral echo of Isildur's triumphant bloodline, forcing Mordor's grand strategic focus onto a ghost of kingship, and blinding the eye to the true, unseen path of destruction approaching from the shadows. Unveil the cryptic terror woven into the reforged blade, Andúril, the flame of the West, detailing why this symbol of Isildur's past victory in the hands of Aragorn represented a metaphysical threat far exceeding any sorcery or army,
resurrecting the unbearable shame of Sauron's original defeat and suggesting the horrifying, unavoidable pattern of history repeating itself under the banner of legitimate human authority. Investigate the profound dread experienced by the solitary Dark Lord when contemplating Aragorn's unique capacity to transcend tribal hatreds and unify the scattered free peoples, elves, dwarves, and men into a cohesive front. This unity, cemented by the king's righteous claim and potentially weaponized by the One Ring's symbolic authority, was an existential dread of collective hope, the inverse mirror of Mordor's mandated isolation and tyranny. Explain the chilling calculus in Sauron's mind that dismissed the ethereal threats posed by Gandalf's luminous wisdom and Galadriel's primal majesty as predictable variables of ancient power, realizing instead that Aragorn represented an entirely untraceable political virus, the legal, historical justification for absolute kingship, transforming the ring from a mere weapon of terror into an irrevocable decree of dominion over the world of men, a shocking shift in the nature of conflict.
Chronicle the shocking blindness induced by Sauron's deep-seated historical trauma concerning the line of Isildur, illustrating how this obsessive fixation on Aragorn as the inevitable, legitimate claimant to the ring became the perfect psychological mechanism of distraction, diverting the eye's terrifying scrutiny from the minuscule, unassuming figures traversing the ash-choked plains, carrying the unthinkable solution of renunciation and ultimate doom. Conjure the apocalyptic nightmare scenario that haunted the Dark Lord, the vision of Aragorn, the newly crowned king of the West, wearing the One Ring not as a corrupted tyrant, but as a seemingly righteous, unifying monarch who commands the loyalty of every free realm, turning the very symbol of darkness into the ultimate insignia of legitimate, benevolent, and thus infinitely more terrifying global dominion. Analyze the fundamentally inexplicable nature of Aragorn's self-restraint and refusal to claim the ring, detailing why this act of monumental abnegation, a concept utterly alien to Sauron's definition of power and purpose, transformed the Dunedain heir into a figure of pure, terrifying unpredictability, a philosophical chasm the calculating mind of Mordor could neither measure nor combat effectively, rendering his every choice a shocking mystery. Describe the crushing weight of ancestral memory that Aragorn represented to Sauron, an eternal, agonizing reminder that it was a mortal man, Isildur, who severed his power, ensuring that every glance toward the north was haunted by the spectral image of Narsil and the shocking potential for history to violently repeat itself through the direct, undisputed return of the ancient enemy's bloodline. Detail the shocking political architecture of fear that drove Sauron's focus, recognizing that Aragorn's primary threat lay not in personal combat prowess, but in the geopolitical catastrophe of reuniting the long-sundered kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, thus creating a legitimate, unified Western Front backed by the unassailable authority of the ancient royal house, a collective willpower impervious to the usual agents of terror and division. Ponder the secretive terror Sauron harbored regarding the One Ring's transmogrification in Aragorn's hands. Moving beyond a tool of magical coercion, the ring would become an untouchable, divinely sanctioned political totem, solidifying the king's dominion and instantly validating the eradication of Mordor, a total reversal of the power dynamic achieved simply through the intersection of ancient law and inherited darkness.
Describe the precise moment of shocking strategic collapse when Sauron's intricate millennial plan failed due to his inability to grasp the concept of selfless sacrifice, choosing instead to anticipate the predictable greed and ambition of a rightful king like Aragorn, thereby fatally misjudging the true nature of the resistance which lay in the unexpected, unassuming refusal to accept power, leading to the ultimate silent victory of humility. Explore the shocking paradox of Aragorn as the ultimate symbol of hope and resurrection, whose very existence shattered Sauron's logic that power must inevitably seek greater power, establishing him as the singular figure whose inherent right to rule and access to the ring presented a systemic threat of renewed order and light that Mordor, built entirely upon corruption and calculated self-interest, could neither tolerate nor logically defeat. Unravel the chilling mystery of why the Dark Lord Sauron's deepest, most crippling fear was not the might of Gandalf or the ancient light of Galadriel, but the mere existence of Aragorn, the uncrowned heir. Investigate how the chilling legacy of Isildur's severed hand and the reforged shard of Narsil created an existential terror in the heart of Mordor that surpassed any magical threat. Analyze the dark psychological mechanism that compelled Sauron to fixate on Aragorn, the rightful king, perceiving him as the inevitable claimant of the One Ring, a calculated error stemming from the Dark Lord's total inability to comprehend the concept of selflessness or the voluntary rejection of absolute power, thereby ensuring his own blind descent into shadow. Delve into the arcane terror invoked by Andúril, the Flame of the West, examining how this reforged blade served not just as a symbol of hope to men, but as a silent, agonizing reminder to Sauron of his previous catastrophic failure, embodying a haunting historical continuity that promised his definitive and shocking second demise at the hands of Isildur's bloodline. Describe the horrifying truth of Aragorn's political power, explaining why his capacity to swiftly unite the fractured realms of men under the banner of legitimate kingship represented a systemic threat far exceeding the isolated might of elven queens or solitary wizards, compelling Sauron to divert massive strategic focus toward this shockingly unifying phantom of the past. Explore the shocking paradox of Aragorn's self-restraint, detailing why his conscious refusal to seize the most powerful artifact in existence, which was arguably his by blood right, rendered him an utterly unpredictable and therefore maximally terrifying opponent to Sauron, whose entire cosmic philosophy was built upon the relentless pursuit of domination and endless, consuming greed.
Investigate the terrifying realization that settled upon Sauron, that Aragorn was not merely a man, but the walking ghost of Isildur, a spectral echo of the ancient enemy who had previously tasted victory against the Shadow, analyzing how this ancestral dread became the core strategic obsession that tragically blinded Mordor to the true, unassuming threat approaching from the east. Illustrate the chilling significance of the return of the king in Sauron's dark prophecy, explaining how the re-establishment of Gondor and Arnor under Aragorn's legitimate rule, symbolized by the ancient crown, acted as the most profound and unsettling magical counterspell to his dominion, promising not just defeat, but the erasure of his entire Dark Age legacy. Detail the masterful, albeit unintended, strategic deception, wherein Aragorn served as the luminous decoy, drawing the full, burning gaze of the Eye of Mordor upon the clash of kings and armies, while concealing the horrifyingly simple truth that the true weapon of doom was borne by the smallest and most contemptuously overlooked agents, moving silently beneath the veil of shadow. Catalog the elements of Aragorn's existence that collectively formed Sauron's perfect dread: the irrefutable blood claim, the enduring memory forged into Andúril, and the catastrophic potential for righteous unification, asking how this unique confluence of legitimacy made the prospective human king the only entity capable of forging the One Ring into a tool of catastrophic, world-ending goodness. chart the inevitable convergence of ancient fate and present peril, exploring the shocking depth of Sauron's terror regarding the fulfillment of the Númenórean legacy, where Aragorn's ascension represented the horrifying cycle turning anew, threatening a final, irrevocable end to the Shadow's dominance, a dread that permeated the very foundations of Barad-dûr itself. Contrast the fleeting, isolated power of the Istari and the Elves with Aragorn's grounded, generational authority, revealing why the potential for a unified, morally centered human monarchy utilizing the ring constituted a more structurally devastating assault on Mordor's rule than any concentrated display of magic, proving that true political legitimacy held a terrifying, mysterious power. Explore the disturbing realization that Aragorn, by choosing self-sacrifice and denying the ring's use, demonstrated a spiritual power that defied Sauron's cosmic understanding of dominance, establishing him as the ultimate, unpredictable threat, not for what he could take, but for what he was fiercely willing to reject, leading to a profound strategic oversight that doomed the Dark Lord.
Investigate the chilling, unfathomable terror that gripped the Dark Lord Sauron. Reveal why the spectral curse of Isildur's ancient bloodline, embodied in the seemingly simple ranger Aragorn, posed a more profound, existential threat to the foundations of Mordor than the combined ethereal might of Gandalf's primordial wisdom or Galadriel's luminous ancient power, forcing a reappraisal of true strength in Middle-earth's shadowed history. Unearth the cryptic psychological dossier compiled by the Eye of Barad-dûr, detailing the strategic dread surrounding Aragorn, the only claimant whose dynastic legitimacy, symbolized by the reforged Flame of the West, Andúril, threatened to weave fragmented men, elves, and dwarves into a unified, unbreakable shield, a sovereign entity far more menacing than any solitary, ring-crazed tyrant Sauron could manipulate. Delve into the abyssal chasm of Sauron's perception, exploring the shocking failure of his calculated evil to comprehend Aragorn's unique, unfettered moral strength. A chilling anomaly that rendered the Ranger an unreadable cipher, capable of rejecting the ring's inherent seductive dominion, a capacity for self-denial that terrified the Dark Lord more than any overt act of magical aggression. Reveal the shadowy calculus determining that Aragorn was not merely a warrior, but a spectral harbinger of the Second Age's dreadful finality, his very existence serving as a politically charged symbol of resurrected hope and legitimate governance, a spiritual weapon whose silent ascension guaranteed the cohesion of free peoples, posing a systemic, existential threat transcending mere battlefield engagements. Analyze the terrifying, masterfully orchestrated deception wherein Aragorn's emergence, crowned with the potential right to wield the One Ring, became the perfect, blinding light, riveting Sauron's omniscient, dreadful gaze onto the grand conflict, deliberately masking the minuscule, unseen threat, the humble vessels carrying the true, annihilating destiny. Explore the gruesome, chronological horror embodied by Aragorn, who resurrected the ancient, unhealed trauma of Isildur's momentary triumph over the Shadow, serving as a visceral, constant premonition of Sauron's inevitable, absolute downfall, a spectral haunting that made the future king the single, most feared constant in the Dark Lord's millennium-spanning strategic nightmares. Investigate the chilling paradox that, had Aragorn claimed the One Ring, his intent to use its limitless power for the righteous restoration of the kingdoms of men would have spawned a terrifying, absolute tyranny of light, a perfectly legitimate dominion whose pure, uncorrupted authority was deemed by Sauron to be far more difficult to fracture and overcome than the brazen corruption of Saruman.
Detail the arcane, strategic dread felt by the Lord of the Earth, who perceived that Aragorn, unlike isolated regional powers, possessed the innate,
terrifying charisma to resurrect Arnor and Gondor, forging the West into a single, devastating military and spiritual monolith, a unified opponent whose collective will the Eye of Mordor could never truly break or subvert through terror alone. Conjure the hidden prophetic texts or dark premonitions within Sauron's mind that specifically isolated the Isildur lineage, perceiving it as the singular, catastrophic vulnerability in his dominion, a fate woven into the fabric of history that guaranteed a challenger would rise with both divine right and the memory of previous defeat, making Aragorn an inescapable, fatal inevitability. Analyze the fundamental, chilling error in Sauron's abyssal logic, where his absolute fixation on hierarchies of raw power and ancient lineage forced him to overlook the profound danger posed by creatures devoid of overt ambition, leading him to obsessively fear Aragorn, the grand symbol, while remaining tragically blind to the silent, unassuming executors of his doom. Describe how the reforging of Narsil into Andúril became a deeply mysterious and traumatizing symbolic act for the Dark Lord, representing the horrific continuity of the ancient defiance, a spectral blade whose very steel whispered the possibility of Sauron's defeat, confirming that Aragorn carried not just a weapon, but the burning, undeniable record of previous failure. Scrutinize the shocking realization that Aragorn's refusal to seize the One Ring imbued him with an unimaginable, almost supernatural power that lay entirely outside Sauron's comprehension, a dreadful, self-imposed limitation that rendered the king-elect the only true free variable, defying the Dark Lord's belief that all power must ultimately submit to absolute mastery. Explore the profoundly disturbing psychological calculus that led Sauron, the architect of ultimate dread, to prioritize the threat of Aragorn's ancient, legitimate bloodline and the newly reforged shard of Narsil over the overt magical might of the Istari, or the ancient elven light. Unveil the chilling truth that true authority, even in the realm of darkness, fears historical legitimacy more than raw power itself, detailing the unseen mechanisms of this unique terror. Detail the spectral horror that grips the Dark Lord when contemplating Andúril, the flame of the West, understanding that its gleam is not merely steel, but a tangible, burning memory of his greatest humiliation, revealing the horrifying, unspoken prophecy that drove Sauron to obsession, fixating on the possibility of a unified, rightful king wielding a weapon forged from his own past defeat, a chilling obsession that diverted his gaze from the actual instruments of his doom. Detail the spectral horror that grips the Dark Lord when contemplating Andúril, the flame of the West, understanding that its gleam is not merely steel, but a tangible, burning memory of his greatest humiliation, revealing the horrifying, unspoken prophecy that drove Sauron to obsession, fixating on the possibility of a unified, rightful king wielding a weapon forged from his own past defeat, a chilling obsession that diverted his gaze from the actual instruments of his doom. Unmask the devastating flaw in Sauron's perception of power, his inability to comprehend a leader like Aragorn, who could wield the unifying political authority necessary to marshal fractured nations without succumbing to the ring's immediate, seductive influence, explaining how this critical blind spot regarding self-restraint and true kingship became the silent, pervasive terror that obscured the infinitesimal, unglamorous threat approaching Mount Doom. Investigate the terrifying scenario lodged deep within the Eye of Mordor, the vision of Aragorn crowned not by conquest, but by the ancient, undeniable right of Isildur's line, using the One Ring not for personal tyranny, but to forge an unstoppable, legitimate anti-Mordor alliance, forcing Sauron to confront the shockingly mysterious concept that a perceived good tyrant wielding his own creation would be infinitely more difficult to corrupt or defeat than any purely evil rival. Describe the horrifying internal logic of Sauron, master of fear, who knew instinctively that a unified realm under the king Elessar, backed by the moral weight and hereditary claim of the Dunedain, represented not just a military challenge, but the existential erasure of his millennia-long project, forcing him to dedicate vast resources to tracking the uncrowned ranger, a shocking diversion based entirely on the dread of political, righteous rebirth. Penetrate the shadowy psychology of the Dark Lord to reveal why the memory of Isildur and its shocking manifestation in Aragorn was more potent than any spell cast by Gandalf or any light emanated by Galadriel. Illuminate the profound secret that Sauron's true vulnerability lay in the traumatic recall of his first mortal defeat, making the lineage of the man who cut the ring the true anchor of his operational fear, dictating a tragically flawed strategy. Analyze the chilling paradox that defined Sauron's strategy, his absolute faith in the irresistible temptation of the One Ring, juxtaposed with the singular, terrifying possibility that Aragorn possessed the inherent strength and legitimate reason, duty to his people, to claim it successfully and use its power against its creator. A shockingly viable scenario that eclipsed all other magical threats in the dreadful hierarchy of Mordor's planning. Detail the subtle, horrifying truth that Aragorn, by refusing the ring, became an even greater threat in Sauron's calculations, as this act of inexplicable self-denial revealed a form of power the Dark Lord could neither understand nor corrupt. A shocking testament to moral fortitude that contradicted the entire foundation of Mordor's worldview, rendering the king Elessar utterly unpredictable and therefore supremely dangerous. Illustrate the shocking realization within Barad-dûr that the primary threat was not the raw magical confrontation anticipated with the Istari, but the potential political unification catalyzed by Aragorn's return, transforming fragmented resistance into a cohesive, dynastically legitimized movement, forcing the eye to focus exclusively on neutralizing this single, monumental symbol of enduring human sovereignty and hope, a focus that proved tragically misplaced. Expose the ancient, primal dread woven into Sauron's being, specifically tied to the concept of Arnor Reborn, where the restoration of the Northern Kingdom by Aragorn signified the complete undoing of his millennial campaign of division and decay, revealing the mysterious fact that the Dark Lord feared a stable, united human future forged in light more than he feared any single devastating clash of arms or spells in the present war. Explore the dark irony of Sauron's strategic oversight, fixated on the towering, shocking danger of Aragorn's legitimate kingship and the iconic power of Andoril, while failing to register the quiet, insidious threat of vulnerability embodied by the two hobbits, demonstrating how his obsession with the traditional symbols of power blinded the Dark Lord to the most effective means of his destruction, a fatal, mysterious misjudgment. Reconstruct the unsettling analysis conducted by Sauron's dark mind regarding Aragorn's charismatic ability to rally the hearts of men, a gift far surpassing the sheer force of Uruk-hai legions. Recognizing that this capacity for freely given loyalty was a shocking vulnerability against the Dark Lord's regime built solely upon coercion and terror, forcing him to view Aragorn as the single greatest ideological threat to his absolute, fear-based dominion. Unveil the shocking secret history whispered in the shadows of Barad-dûr. Why did the ghost of Isildur's triumph, embodied in the reforged blade Andoril, induce a paralyzing existential terror in Sauron far greater than the combined might of Istari or Elven queens, suggesting a profound flaw in the Dark Lord's logic concerning bloodright and the horrifying potential for historical repetition?
describe the terrifying vision that perpetually haunted the Eye of Mordor, a vision not of chaotic destruction, but of silent, lawful unity under the banner of the returning king, Aragorn, whose legitimate claim and power to wield the ring for unification posed a systemic, shocking threat far surpassing individual magical prowess or millennia-old cunning, revealing Sauron's fatal inability to comprehend unifying hope. Detail the mysterious, strategic miscalculation that sealed the fate for Mordor. Why did the overwhelming presence of Aragorn, the legitimate heir, serve as the perfect, radiant decoy, captivating Sauron's attention completely and obscuring the minuscule, unseen movement of the true threat, revealing the Dark Lord's shocking inability to perceive power beyond kingship and immense stature, and resulting in his absolute downfall? Investigate the terrifying, self-fulfilling prophecy inherent in Sauron's twisted logic. Since he could not conceive of the ring's ultimate destruction, he had to conclude that only Aragorn, possessing absolute legitimacy and the political capacity to unify the West, was the single most credible candidate destined to seize the artifact and wield its power against him. A shocking projection of the Dark Lord's own insatiable ambition and deepest dread. Explore the shockingly incomprehensible nature of Aragorn's restraint in Sauron's mind. How could a king of men, blessed by lineage and burdened by duty, possess the terrifying, alien resolve to reject the ultimate tool of dominance, a decision that fundamentally defied the Dark Lord's millennia-old understanding of mortal and immortal greed, rendering Aragorn an unpredictably formidable ghost of hope, capable of systemic change? Analyze the shocking realization that Aragorn's greatest weapon was not the blade Andúril or any inherent magical prowess, but his profound symbolic resonance, the living embodiment of the covenant that defeated Sauron long ago, representing the terrifying possibility of historical recurrence, backed by the legitimacy necessary to politically mobilize every free kingdom against the Shadow in a final, unified strike. Detailed the catastrophic scenario Sauron dreaded above all others, the instantaneous unification of Gondor and Arnor under Aragorn, creating an unstoppable political and military bloc that, if armed with the ring, would establish an enduring new world order founded on loyalty and hope, a devastating conceptual antithesis to Mordor's rule by terror, making the return of the king a deeply shocking political threat. Explore the mysterious hierarchy of fear within Sauron's twisted mind. Why was the grounded, legitimate threat posed by the mere existence of Aragorn, a mortal king heir, carrying the stain of ancient victory, deemed exponentially more perilous than the cosmic power of Gandalf, the ancient light of Galadriel, or the corrupted ambition of Saruman, fundamentally challenging conventional expectations of Middle-earth's power structures?
Analyze the shocking psychological impact of Isildur's bloodline on Sauron. Aragorn was the only living being who could claim the ring not just through conquest or raw ambition, but through inherited vengeance, making his potential seizure of the artifact a personalized, genealogical affront that reopened the deepest, most excruciating wound inflicted by the last alliance, paralyzing the Dark Lord with historical dread. Describe the terrifying, uncanny ability of Aragorn to unify disparate, broken nations, a leadership quality that Sauron, relying solely on coercion and fear, found utterly mysterious and destabilizing. Understanding that the ring in the hands of this legitimate, charismatic king would not just enslave, but fundamentally reconstitute the free world into an unstoppable force for permanent resistance, a shockingly existential threat. Examine why the newly forged Andúril, the Flame of the West, became an object of such profound, shocking terror for the Dark Lord. It was not merely a sharp sword, but a gleaming, physical manifestation of Sauron's most catastrophic historical failure,
wielded by the only man whose very existence promised the literal repeat of that millennia-old defeat, a terrifying outcome Sauron desperately tried to circumvent. Analyze the chilling irony of Sauron's downfall, his obsessive focus on neutralizing the highly visible, legitimate, and historically validated threat embodied by Aragorn, the new Isildur, resulted in a catastrophic oversight, failing to grasp the terrifying concept that selflessness and humility, rather than raw power, held the key to his destruction, a shocking failure of his foundational dark philosophy and ultimate undoing. Unveil the clandestine terror gripping the Dark Lord's fortress, a chilling dread rooted not in wizardry or ancient elven might, but in the lineage of a mere man. Explore the catastrophic political and spiritual implications of Andúril, the reforged blade of Isildur, and how its very existence, wielded by Aragorn, represented a legitimate, shattering continuity that Sauron's dominion was psychically unable to overcome, a spectral history demanding violent repetition. Describe the horrific inverted calculation performed by Sauron's dark intellect, where the ultimate power of the One Ring became a liability not through destruction, but through its potential legitimate use by a true king. Examine why the concept of a unifying, righteous tyrant, Aragorn, using the ultimate symbol of evil against its creator, was a conceptual anomaly that fractured the Dark Lord's strategic mind, leading him to prioritize the visible threat over the unseen, silent peril.
Detail the spectral agony of Sauron, perpetually haunted by the memory of Isildur's severed hand and the historical scar it left upon his essence. Investigate how Aragorn, as the living, breathing manifestation of this primal failure, stirred a deeper, existential fear in Mordor than the collected wisdom of the Istari or the light of Lothlorien, forcing the shadow to focus its vast, crushing might upon the returning king. Explore the devastating realization within the deepest pits of Barad-dûr that the true threat lay in Aragorn's terrifying capacity to unite the broken kingdoms through hope rather than fear. Elaborate on why a legitimate, willingly accepted kingship, reinforced by the potential claim to the ring, posed a fundamental, horrifying reversal of Sauron's fundamental tenets of power and control, rendering him strategically blind to the quieter, crucial movements of the world. Narrate the shocking paradox where Aragorn's glorious return served as the ultimate, necessary deception, a blazing distraction crafted by fate to focus the eye of Mordor upon a confrontation of equal power, thereby allowing the true, minuscule mechanism of Sauron's final ruin, the hobbits, to move silently through the periphery. Analyze the profound psychological blindness induced by an ancient, consuming fear of legitimacy. Describe the occult significance of the crown and the sword in Sauron's distorted worldview. Reveal why Aragorn's potential coronation, buttressed by the symbolic weight of Andúril and the inherent claim to the ring, represented not merely a change of government, but the apocalyptic rebirth of an enemy archetype, a sovereign power so utterly legitimate that its resistance was cosmically reinforced and thus unthinkable to defeat. Investigate the chasm of incomprehension separating Sauron's logic from Aragorn's moral resilience. Detail the horrific, unsettling nature of a man who possessed the legitimate right and capacity to claim the ultimate power, the ring, yet chose self-denial, a conceptual surrender that invalidated every premise of the Dark Lord's universe and made Aragorn an infinitely more unpredictable, terrifying foe than a greedy rival. Conceive a secret council report from the mouths of the Ringwraiths, detailing their chilling assessment of Aragorn as the singular, most destabilizing political force. Explain why the prospective unification of Gondor and Arnor under his banner, driven by ancient mandate and popular loyalty, was deemed a greater, more systematic threat to the duration of Mordor's dominance than any fleeting magical assault from the elves or wizards. chronicle the paralyzing existential dread within Sauron concerning the cyclical nature of history, specifically the terrifying possibility that Aragorn represented the inevitable second iteration of the last alliance, possessing the unique ability to mobilize all free races under a banner of undeniable royal authority, which had been the only force capable of defeating him before. Delve into the enigmatic, shadowed decades of Aragorn's life as a ranger, arguing that Sauron perceived these unseen years not as mere wandering, but as a period of calculated, occult preparation, amassing the hidden loyalties and unspoken spiritual mandate necessary to finally challenge the Shadow with a political legitimacy that transcended mere brute force or magic. Analyze the terrifying psychological reflection Sauron saw when gazing upon Aragorn, realizing that the king represented the possibility of true, unified rule, a dark mirror showing what Sauron might have become had he sought loyalty instead of subjugation. This subconscious recognition of a superior, legitimate counterpart fueled a hatred born of agonizing self-deception and dread. Outline the terrifying blind spot in Sauron's hyper-logical, power-obsessed paradigm, specifically his inability to integrate genuine self-sacrifice or moral resistance into his war calculations. Explain why Aragorn's known integrity and potential ability to wield the ring for just ends made him a metaphysical threat, fundamentally altering the expected rules of engagement which Sauron had meticulously codified over millennia. Delve into the chilling psychological profile of Sauron, illuminating the hidden depths of his ancient dread, which centered not on celestial magic or immortal might, but upon the shockingly legitimate claim of Aragorn, the spectral descendant of Ildur, whose very bloodline represented the terrifying possibility of historical reversal and the resurgence of unified mortal rule, a concept that fundamentally fractured the Dark Lord's perception of eternal dominion. Reveal the shocking truth behind why the newly reforged blade Andúril, the Flame of the West, terrorized the Dark Lord more profoundly than any army of men or elf-crafted spell, serving as a visceral, sharp reminder of his initial catastrophic defeat and embodying the cruel potential for history to repeat itself under the hand of the legitimate heir, forcing Sauron to perpetually confront the spectral agony of his greatest failure. Investigate the cryptic calculus that led the Master of Strategy to prioritize the threat of an uncrowned Dunedain ranger over the primal light of Galadriel or the divine guidance of Gandalf, uncovering the shocking realization that Aragorn possessed the unique, lethal ability to weaponize hope and political unity, transforming the ring not into a magical focus, but into an unbreakable, legitimate political seal for a new world order Sauron could neither corrupt nor control.
Explore the profound, shocking blindness inherent in Sauron's power-obsessed intellect, which fixated solely on the towering threat of Aragorn, the rightful king, as the ultimate claimant to the ring, causing the Dark Lord to completely overlook the insidious, silent danger posed by the insignificant hobbit, whose very existence defied Sauron's ironclad logic that absolute power must inevitably be desired and wielded by the great. Unravel the shocking paradox that paralyzed the Dark Lord's understanding. Aragorn, the sole individual with the ancestral mandate and inherent strength to successfully command the One Ring, chose instead the path of self-denial, presenting Sauron with an incomprehensible act of free will and self-sacrifice that shattered his calculated assumption that all beings, especially those of royal ambition, are eternally slaves to insatiable greed and ultimate authority. Describe the shocking, underlying terror felt by the Shadow concerning Aragorn's potent and mysterious charisma, an innate quality far more dangerous than martial prowess, allowing him to weave together disparate races, elves, dwarves, and men, into a unified, unbreakable front, thus creating a legitimate, cohesive force whose loyalty stemmed from hope rather than fear, a concept that represented the absolute antithesis of Mordor's foundational philosophy. Analyze the shocking symbolism embedded within Aragorn's return, representing not merely a physical enemy, but the terrifying manifestation of the King's Peace, an era of legitimate governance and restorative justice that fundamentally threatened the nihilistic chaos Sauron sought to impose, making him the personification of the ancient order that the Dark Lord desperately wished to erase from all memory and history. Contrast the calculating fear Sauron harbored for the predictable ambition of Saruman and the passionate frailty of Boromir with the deep, inexplicable dread inspired by Aragorn, whose refusal to be easily categorized or corrupted presented a shocking unknown variable that defied all of the Dark Lord's established models for manipulating powerful beings through their inherent flaws or their predictable lust for domination. Chronicle the shockingly effective strategic distraction played by Aragorn, whose very presence as the rallying point for the armies of the West successfully absorbed the entirety of Sauron's strategic focus and paranoia, allowing the true, minuscule agents of doom to slip through the guarded gates of Mordor unnoticed, ultimately proving that overwhelming symbolic threat can mask the silent execution of inevitable defeat.
Detail the chilling, inescapable resonance of Isildur's original act of cutting the ring from Sauron's hand, projecting that ancient trauma onto Aragorn as a potential new iteration of catastrophic defeat, establishing a shocking, perpetual psychological vulnerability in the Dark Lord's otherwise invincible mind, forever haunted by the possibility of the royal lineage rising again to exact total vengeance and end his reign once more. Imagine the shocking scenario Sauron mentally rehearsed: Aragorn claiming the ring and becoming a tyrant of hope, a sovereign so legitimate and powerful that he could enforce peace through sheer, unchallengeable authority, leading to a perfectly unified world that was just as inimical to Sauron's chaos as any light, thereby creating a rival despotism built on law and loyalty, a frightening inversion of Mordor's terror-based regime. Reflect upon the shocking, cosmic irony of Sauron's downfall, realizing that his absolute fear of Aragorn, the embodiment of traditional power and legitimacy, was fundamentally correct according to the logic of domination, yet utterly irrelevant to the true crisis, proving that the deepest mysteries of strength reside not in the crowns or legendary blades, but in the unseen, sacrificial determination of the humble, defying the very notion of predictable power structures. Unveil the dreadful historical weight that made Aragorn, the uncrowned ranger, the absolute apex of Sauron's paranoia, detailing how the specter of Isildur's lineage and the shattered blade Narsil, reforged into Andúril, triggered an ancient, primal fear within the Dark Lord, forcing him to divert his strategies toward neutralizing this singular, legitimate threat of returning kingship, a chilling paradox Sauron could never fully comprehend. Explore the shockingly mysterious truth that Sauron's true dread stemmed not from magic or raw power, but from the political legitimacy embodied by Aragorn. Describe how the potential for the Dunedain heir to wield the One Ring, not through ambition, but through rightful inheritance, could galvanize the fractured kingdoms of men into a unified, sacred force capable of extinguishing the shadow forever, an outcome so contrary to the logic of tyranny that it paralyzed Mordor's strategic planning. Describe the profound psychological tunnel vision that caused the Dark Lord, master of foresight, to fixate entirely on Aragorn as the expected claimant, the grand, logical rival, while the true, silent, and most terrifying threat materialized unseen in the unassuming shadows of the journey, revealing how Sauron's own entrenched belief in the irresistibility of absolute power tragically obscured the possibility of utter self-sacrifice and the destruction of the ring itself.
Investigate the chilling symbolism of Andúril, the reforged flame of the West, examining how this singular weapon became a living, agonizing reminder of Sauron's original defeat at the hands of Isildur's ancestor, thus making Aragorn's mere possession of the blade a psychological warfare element far more dreadful to the Dark Lord than the combined might of elven rings or the wizard's staff, a silent prophecy of inevitable doom. Detail the inexplicable horror Sauron felt towards Aragorn's disciplined refusal to claim the One Ring, an act of shocking humility and self-control that defied the Dark Lord's entire worldview rooted in inescapable greed. Explore how this moral paradox transformed Aragorn from a mere foe into an incomprehensible anomaly, representing a form of ancient strength Sauron had utterly purged from his understanding of the world, making him the most unpredictable rival. Contrast Aragorn's unique threat level with that of Gandalf and Galadriel, dissecting the secret reason why the uncrowned king, though lacking their sheer magical essence, possessed a terrifying inherent legitimacy, a dynastic claim that, when coupled with the ring, would forge an unbreakable political and spiritual counterpower that Sauron could never subvert through corruption, only through annihilation, a dreadful reality. Analyze the profound dread experienced by Sauron concerning Aragorn's potential to inaugurate a new, unified age of men, arguing that the Dark Lord viewed the heir of Isildur not just as an enemy commander, but as the harbinger of a catastrophic societal rebirth, a return to moral order and collective heroism which would permanently shatter the fragmentation that Sauron relied upon for his reign of terror, revealing the deepest secret fear of the Shadow. Illuminate the shocking strategic nightmare Aragorn represented, the perfect convergence of ancient lineage, military charisma, and moral integrity, demonstrating how Sauron correctly perceived that Aragorn, wielding the ring, would create a legitimate, global power structure that would unite every free race under a noble banner, thereby nullifying Mordor's primary weapon, pervasive distrust and calculated discord among the alliances of the West. Explore the chilling inherited curse of Isildur's bloodline, tracing how Aragorn carried not just a crown's claim, but the very memory of Sauron's previous downfall, making his presence an existential threat that resonated through the fabric of Mordor itself. Detail the unsettling awareness Sauron held that this single man was the living embodiment of his greatest historical failure, predestined by fate to seek his utter ruin. Illuminate the shocking strategic nightmare Aragorn represented, the perfect convergence of ancient lineage, military charisma, and moral integrity, demonstrating how Sauron correctly perceived that Aragorn, wielding the ring, would create a legitimate, global power structure that would unite every free race under a noble banner, thereby nullifying Mordor's primary weapon, pervasive distrust and calculated discord among the alliances of the West. Explore the chilling inherited curse of Isildur's bloodline, tracing how Aragorn carried not just a crown's claim, but the very memory of Sauron's previous downfall, making his presence an existential threat that resonated